really just sound made up, like just completely fictional, totally insane, but they're not. In fact, they all were reported in reputable media outlets around the world. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, go ahead and start a friendly pillow fight with the like button, but don't tell them you've secretly filled your pillow with quarters. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of August 15th, 2022, a 24-year-old beauty influencer and blogger named Sharaban K put on her makeup in front of a mirror in her bedroom in Munich, Germany. But this was actually Sharaban's childhood bedroom. She was in the home she grew up in. And looking around, it looked basically exactly the way it had when she was a teenager, when she last lived here. There were still pictures of her with her high school friends taped to the walls, and there were brightly colored pillows and furniture, like it was a time capsule of when she was in high school. But now, she's 24 years old. But the reason she was back here and living in this bedroom all over again is because just a few months ago, she had separated from her husband and had to move back in with her parents. And while her parents did accept her home, they were not exactly happy to have her here. So Sharaban's family belonged to a small ethnic religion called Yazidism. And one of the rules of this religion was that you absolutely cannot get divorced. And so this was a problem for Sharaban because things were not going well for her in her marriage, and she really wanted out. But both her parents and her husband's family refused to allow a divorce, and so she had just left. But in many ways, that had not solved the problem because basically everybody involved here, with the exception of Sharaban, was totally furious about the separation. Sharaban's own parents, they had agreed to take Sharaban back home, but it was on the condition that she would only be here until she and her husband fixed things, because they had to, because they couldn't get divorced. But Sharaban had no intention of ever going back with her husband. Really, no matter the pressure anybody applied, it was not going to happen. And this was primarily because Sharaban actually had a secret, and that was, a few weeks ago, she had met someone new, a young man named Shakir. And so when Sharaban was out at work, at least that's what she told her parents, in reality, she was actually just visiting with Shakir. And even though, Sharaban understood that her romance with Shakir was not only sort of forbidden, but also brand new, she still felt like there was something very real between them that was worth holding on to. In fact, their relationship was so good in their own eyes that the two of them had been working really hard on this plan that was going to get Sharaban out of her current predicament and away from her own family, and critically, away from her husband and his family. It was going to get her out of this marriage. Now, Sharaban's phone buzzed on her makeup table, so she put down her mascara, she picked up her phone, and saw she had a notification from her Instagram account. So she opened the phone up, opened up Instagram, and saw she had a direct message from the person she was currently getting all made up for, who she planned on meeting that night. And meeting this person was actually the first step in Sharaban and Shakir's plan. So Sharaban felt her nerves buzzing as she read the DM with excitement, and then afterwards she finished putting on her makeup, she brushed her long black hair, and then she grabbed her purse, and then she headed out into the living room, and she told her parents who were out there that she was heading out. She was going to Ingolstadt, a city about an hour away, and that she'd be back in maybe a few hours. And so her parents are like, great, we'll see you then. And so Sharaban, she smiled, she walked out the door, she climbed into her Mercedes, and she drove off. But Sharaban, that night, didn't come back. A few hours after she left her house, her mom began texting her, asking where she was. But Sharaban didn't answer. So eventually her mom began calling her, but her phone just rang and went straight to voicemail, and she didn't call back. And by about 11 p.m. that night, when still Sharaban had not come home and nobody had seen or heard from her, Sharaban's mom was getting really worried. So the city where Sharaban had said she was going to, Ingolstadt, was actually where her husband lived. And so Sharaban's parents had actually been secretly kind of excited that maybe they were patching things up tonight and they might be getting back together soon. But for Sharaban to just disappear like this late at night and tell nobody was just so out of character that Sharaban's mom now couldn't help but think, like, well, what if Sharaban and her husband did see each other, and what if they got into a big fight? Like, what if something bad happened? She didn't know. And so for her mom, she just couldn't stand to just wait around and hope her daughter turned up or hope her daughter got in touch. And so instead, she told her husband to grab the car keys because they were going to Ingolstadt to find their daughter. By about midnight, Sharaban's mother and father were in the car, Sharaban's dad was driving, and they were speeding through Ingolstadt. They were getting close to Sharaban's husband's flat, and their plan was to go knock on his door, didn't matter how late it was, and just see if Sharaban was in there or if the husband knew where she was, just anything to help them find their daughter. However, as they turned onto a quiet street that ran alongside a river, the mom suddenly yelled out to her husband, "Stop the car, stop!" And so the dad, he hits the brakes, he pulls over and stops, and the mom leaps out and she's pointing at something, and it's their daughter's car. It was parked right off the road, the Mercedes, right near the bank of this river. And so as the mom is running up to the car, she's telling herself that, like, here's the explanation. My daughter must have just had car troubles. That's why she's delayed. That's why she hasn't been in touch. Like, here it is, like, no big deal. She's gonna be in here. Everything's gonna be fine. But she runs up to the driver's side of that car and she looks in, and at first, she doesn't see anything. There's nobody in the front two seats of the car. It looks like no one's in there. But then she looks into the back seat of the car and she sees Sharaban, and she clearly is dead. Just minutes later, this street was absolutely crawling with police officers and emergency vehicles. And not long after that, Sharaban's parents, who were standing not far from their daughter's car, had to watch as police officers pried open the locked back door of their daughter's car, and then they reached in and they pulled out Sharaban's lifeless body. And she was covered in blood, and her body was also showing signs of rigor mortis. So it was sort of stiff, and to the parents, it was just horrible. The discovery of Sharaban's body immediately launched a full-scale police investigation. The city of Ingolstadt was relatively small, with a population of just about 80,000 people, and most years there actually were no murders there at all. So this was like a really big deal. When the homicide detectives showed up on the scene, right away, just from looking at the body, they could tell that whoever killed Sharaban had done so in sort of like a wild frenzy, because Sharaban had been stabbed more than 50 times in the torso and the face. And so to detectives, this kind of overkill suggested that whoever killed Sharaban had to have had some really personal reason to go after her. And it didn't take the lead detectives very long to learn from Sharaban's very distraught parents that Sharaban's marriage was in trouble. And her estranged husband actually lived nearby, and they believed, the parents, that perhaps Sharaban had come here to Ingolstadt to visit with him. And so he lives nearby, they're in the process of potentially getting divorced, and so the detectives are thinking, seems an awful lot like the husband could be involved here. Within a couple of hours, Sharaban's body had been shipped off to the medical examiner for an official autopsy, and at the same time, the lead detective on the case had gone to Sharaban's estranged husband's home and hauled him down to the police station to be interviewed. Now, the detective had figured this would be a pretty, open and shut case. He fully expected the husband to have visible injuries on him and to be acting very wired and nervous, because he's the one who must have killed Sharaban. However, when the detective actually met the husband turned out to be a very weak suspect. He had cooperated immediately and fully with investigators, and even offered to let them search his home and take his DNA. And he had an alibi for most of the evening before he'd gone to bed. And even though technically he didn't have anyone who could vouch for him while he had been sleeping, at least according to him, the detective doubted that just based on time, he would have been able to get up, leave his place, go kill her, dispose of the body, clean up, and then get back home again. It didn't seem possible. As for Sharaban's own family, beyond the husband, they really had no other idea about who might have wanted to hurt her. To their knowledge, Sharaban didn't have any other romantic partners other than her estranged husband, and she didn't socialize much outside of work. They said that really the only place where she met new people was on social media, because she was a beauty influencer and she posted photos and videos and gave advice on fashion. So 8 hours after Sharaban's body was discovered, so this is the morning of August 16th, the lead detective put out a release to the media asking for help from the public to identify suspects. And then he started digging into Sharaban's social media accounts. Just 24 hours later, on the morning of August 17th, 2022, so now just a day and a half after Sharaban was found dead inside of her car, her murder was solved. But the people involved in this murder truly shocked everyone. So Sharaban, she meets this new guy, Shakir, and she's madly in love with him, and the two of them, they just want to run off and be together, but Sharaban's, she's married, and she can't get out of that marriage very easily. And so the two of them, Sharaban and Shakir, they're trying to think of, how can we get Sharaban out of this marriage? How can we free her? And at first, it was like dead end after dead end. There was like no way out. But then they thought of something, and it was very clever. But it was something that they needed help doing. It was not just in their power to pull this plan off. They needed a third person. Specifically, they needed to find another influencer, another beauty influencer. And so on the night of August 15th, so this is the night that ultimately Sharaban is found dead inside of her car, she found an influencer that was going to be perfect for this plan. Her name was Khadija, and she was also a beauty influencer. And on the night of the 15th, that's the person that Sharaban was going out to meet. That was the person she was messaging with on Instagram. And so Sharaban and also Shakir, they go into Ingolstadt and they meet up with Khadija, but they didn't fully inform Khadija about what exactly this plan entailed. In fact, really all they told Khadija was that once we meet up with you, we're beauty influencers, we have some really cool beauty products that we'll just give you. And Khadija's like, great. And so Sharaban and Shakir, they drive up alongside the curb, and there's Khadija, and she sees them, and she's all excited. She gets inside the car, inside of Sharaban's Mercedes, and once she's inside, she doesn't receive beauty products. Instead, Sharaban and Shakir pull out knives, and they proceed to stab Khadija to death right there inside of the car. And then once she was dead, Sharaban and Shakir drove the Mercedes right outside of Sharaban's estranged husband's apartment complex. They left the car there with the body inside, and then Sharaban and Shakir fled. It was all part of the plan. Khadija didn't know the plan, but it was all part of Sharaban and Shakir's plan. However, there's one detail that I've left out to this point that is effectively the actual reason Sharaban and Shakir were so convinced their big plan was going to work. So Sharaban didn't just need some random beauty influencer for their plan to work out. No, their plan was that Sharaban would find another beauty influencer that looked a lot like her, hopefully, that they would kill, they'd plant their body, and then Sharaban would take their identity, and she and Shakir would run off under this new false identity and live their lives, free of the marriage that Sharaban was trapped inside of. That was their plan. So they start looking for an influencer, and they find Khadija, and she is like an exact replica of Sharaban. They look identical. So much so that after they murdered her and planted her body inside of Sharaban's car and left her there to be discovered, they had everybody fooled, including Sharaban's own parents. They saw the body and they're like, oh, that's my daughter. They believed fully it was their daughter. The plan worked, and the husband's implicated for killing Sharaban. Everything's working out. But the one person that was not fooled was ultimately the coroner. Because when he began doing the autopsy, the body looked exactly like Sharaban's, except their teeth were different. They had different dental records, and that is the thing that showed this is not Sharaban, this is somebody else. And so at the same time that the coroner made this discovery, also all these people in Ingolstadt were calling the police saying, I think I just saw Sharaban. I don't think she's dead at all. I think she's at this cafe, or I think she's walking down the road over here. She seems just fine. And initially, police sort of dismissed these tips as being just bad tips, but when they put it all together and they looked at Sharaban's social media and her messages back and forth with Khadija, and when they saw a picture of Khadija, they put it all together and they figured it out. And so after putting all these things together, they actually went and found Sharaban, who had been spotted on security footage. They arrested her, they arrested Shakir, and then after, speaking to them and putting all the evidence together, they figured out that this had been their plan all along. And so both Sharaban and Shakir were ultimately found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. One morning in August of 1987, A 57-year-old woman named Claudia Ceci walked down the aisle of a historic church in Lyon, France. In the back of the church, a musician was playing a very solemn hymn on a pipe organ, and right behind Claudia, 4 of her sons and nephews were carrying her husband's coffin. So Claudia's husband had died suddenly just a few days ago, and she still really couldn't believe he was gone. A part of her kept thinking that like any day now, she was gonna get a call from the morgue telling her there'd been a mistake and her husband had just been asleep this whole time. But as she took her seat in the front row and looked around at all the friends and the family that were gathered there wearing black and dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs, she finally began to accept the truth. Eventually, the organ music dies out and the church goes totally quiet, and the priest makes his way up to the pulpit to begin the funeral mass. However, right as he began speaking, there was this sort of muffled sound that at first it was really hard to tell what it was, but it was loud enough that it stopped the priest from speaking. He stopped what he was doing and sort of looked around, and then people began to gasp in the church because the sound, this muffled sound, it was coming from inside the casket. And so Claudia, when she realized that, she shot up to her feet and she's staring at the casket, and everyone's like, what's going on? And then people began to scream because suddenly they realized what the sound was. It was a voice, and it was muffled because it was coming from inside the casket, and the voice, which was a man's voice, was saying, "Let me out of here." And so the priest, he's overlooking this scene of absolute chaos. He's seeing everybody screaming and running around. Nobody knows what to make of this. He's terrified. He's presided over hundreds of funerals before. He's never ever heard of somebody waking up in the middle of their funeral. And he's looking over at Claudia, the widow, and at first she seems so happy, like scared, terrified, but happy like her husband is back, and she begins to run towards the coffin. But she only makes it a few steps before she grabs at her chest and she collapses to the ground. And this seemed to snap the priest out of his shocked daze here. And he ran down to Claudia, and other people were running over to Claudia, and the priest began yelling for someone to call an ambulance. And then he rushed over to the coffin, expecting to find that Claudia's husband was somehow still alive, and he was going to open it up and free him. But when he opened up the coffin, the husband was obviously dead. There's no way he just yelled, "Let me out of here." Not possible. He was definitely dead. So at first, this was just like a terrifying scandal that was sort of localized. But after police investigated and figured out what actually happened inside of that church, this story blew up and ricocheted all around the world. Because truly, it is unbelievable what happened inside of the church on that day. It would turn out there was a man in attendance that day at the funeral who was both one of Claudia's husband's friends, so he was there, grieving the loss of his friend, and he was also a ventriloquist, somebody who's able to throw their voice. And he thought it would cheer everyone up if he threw his voice and made it sound like the dead man, his buddy, was crying, "Let me out of here," from inside the coffin. It was meant to lighten the mood. But the prank worked so well that people thought it was real, and Claudia literally thought it was her husband coming back to life, and she was so overwhelmed as she ran to her husband that she had a heart attack and died. Now, the friend, the ventriloquist, immediately took responsibility and felt horrible. He felt like he basically killed Claudia. But despite that, police never charged him with any crime because ventriloquism is not illegal. On the morning of March 18th, 1963, a 16-year-old girl named Eileen Welch was chatting with her friends outside of her high school in Yorkshire, England. It was a few minutes before first period, and there were dozens of other students milling around outside the school, waiting for the bell to ring. Eileen was holding an armful of books and telling her friends about what she had done over the weekend, when suddenly she began to scream. At that same exact moment, Eileen's friend, who had been standing with her just a moment ago, watched as Eileen just began to rise into the air. There was nothing around her lifting her up. She just began inexplicably raising into the air, like 30 feet into the air, and she's screaming. And like this friend, she's looking up at her, and all around her, all the other students, they're looking up at Eileen, just being suspended in air by some phantom force. And Eileen, she's screaming, and then suddenly she comes careening down and slams into the ground so hard that everybody's just screaming like mad. And someone began running towards the school, yelling for someone to call an ambulance. Eileen was rushed to the hospital, clearly in agonizing pain with, multiple broken bones, severe internal injuries. And the first responders and the doctors at the hospital and the medical staff, they did everything they could to save her. But just 2 hours after she smashed into the ground from, falling from 30 feet in the air somehow, she died. When police went back to the school to begin their investigation into what happened, detectives literally could not believe the dozens of eyewitness accounts. The detectives questioned 37 students and teachers who were all outside that day that watched what happened to Eileen. And all of them told the same story, that Eileen, out of nowhere, just suddenly rose into the air like 30 feet, and she held up there for a second, and then came smashing down. Now, at first, the police just didn't believe the stories they were being told. They're thinking there's got to be more to this story. People don't just raise into the air and smash back down again. That doesn't happen. But when all these accounts were the same, and they all had the same amount of conviction behind them that these people, they saw this, the police realized, this is apparently what happened. And so they began to assume that the only way this could have happened is that this was some product of a bizarre weather phenomenon or something, like a mini tornado, lifted her into the air or something. So they actually brought in several meteorologists into this investigation. But the meteorologists concluded that what everyone claimed to have witnessed was basically scientifically impossible. Because in order for the wind to pick someone up the way they described Eileen being picked up, the winds would need to be blowing at least 110 miles per hour. And there were no winds of anywhere near that speed reported anywhere in England that morning. And even if there had been a sudden gust of wind that was able to lift Eileen up, the reason that still couldn't have happened the way it was described is Eileen was near other people in close proximity. There's no way that she would be the only one affected. Other people would have been blown into the sky, but nobody was. It was just Eileen. To this day, none of the 37 witnesses have changed their stories, and there has never been a scientific explanation for what happened to Eileen. And so the cause of her death, to this day, remains a mystery.
At 6:15 a.m. on the 12th of January 1965, among the desolate sand dunes of Wanda Beach south of Sydney, Australia, a man walking his dog suddenly noticed something protruding from the white sand. It was not a piece of driftwood or the remains of a stranded animal. It was a human hand. Just a few hours earlier, two teenage girls had been laughing and enjoying the summer sunshine. Now they lay motionless in a vast maze of shifting sand, while the person responsible seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no murder weapon. Only a crime scene that appeared to have been erased by nature itself. So, who hunted down these two girls in the middle of that raging sandstorm, and how did the killer disappear without leaving behind a single trace? Everything will be revealed by the end of this story. And this is just one of the 5 most mysterious and controversial death cases that we will explore in today's video. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do. Tonight we have a lineup of stories that will take you into some of the most isolated places where things went wrong. If that is something you enjoy, please buy the like button, a ticket to a comedy show. But secretly tell the comedian to only tell jokes about the like button's deepest secrets. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you do not miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get back into today's story. The story actually begins 24 hours earlier, on a blazing hot Monday morning, January 11th. The temperature in Sydney had soared past 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and 15-year-old Marianne Schmidt and her best friend, 15-year-old Christine Sherrock, decided they could not spend another minute trapped inside their stuffy suburban homes. They were, typical teenagers full of life, always laughing and talking about their plans for the upcoming school year. Marianne's family had recently migrated to Australia from Germany, and she was still adjusting to the intense summer weather. Christine was her constant companion, helping her navigate her new life, and the two girls were completely inseparable. Around mid-morning, the girls packed their canvas beach bags with towels, extra clothes, and a little bit of pocket money their parents had given them. They caught a crowded local bus headed south toward the coast, chatting excitedly over the roar of the engine. By the time they arrived at the Cronulla area, the weather had begun to take a dramatic and unpleasant turn. A fierce, kind of relentless wind was blowing in from the ocean, whipping up the sand and turning what should have been a relaxing beach day into a chaotic mess. The water was rough, and the main beach was becoming increasingly deserted as families packed up their umbrellas to escape the stinging dust. But Marianne and Christine did not want to go home just yet. They walked over to a small beachside kiosk near the edge of the dunes to get some lunch. The worker behind the counter would later recall seeing the two teenagers giggling as they ordered some meat pies and soft drinks. The worker noted that the girls seemed completely unbothered by the worsening weather, though the wind was slamming against the glass windows of the kiosk. After paying for their food, the girls looked out at the vast expanse of the Wanda sand dunes stretching out directly behind the beach. It was a massive desert-like wilderness of shifting sand, completely isolated from the main roads. The girls decided to walk directly into the heart of the dunes, looking for a low hollow or a sheltered valley where the massive hills of sand would block the brutal wind. They figured they could sit down, eat their lunch in peace, and wait for the storm to blow over before heading into the water. Several witnesses reported seeing the two bright towels disappearing over the crest of the first major dune around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They were walking side by side, their heads down against the flying dust, and that was the last time anyone ever saw Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sherrick alive. Back in their suburban neighborhood, the afternoon began to fade into evening. Marianne's mother, Elizabeth, kept looking at the clock on the kitchen wall. She had expected the girls to be back by 5 o'clock to help prepare dinner. When 6 o'clock arrived and the house remained quiet, a subtle knot of worry began to form in her stomach. Marianne was an incredibly responsible girl who never missed her curfew without calling. So Elizabeth walked into the living room where her younger son Peter was playing and asked if his sister had mentioned making any detours on her way home. Peter shook his head, looking up from his toys with a confused expression. By 7 o'clock, the sun was dipping below the horizon and the worry turned into flat-out panic. Elizabeth grabbed the telephone and called Christine's house. When Christine's mother answered, she confirmed that her daughter hadn't come home either. The two mothers stood on the line for a long moment, the silence heavy between them as they realized something was wrong. They decided to wait another 30 minutes, hoping the girls had just missed a bus or gotten tracked down by friends. But when the clock struck 8, both families left their homes and walked quickly through the dark streets toward the local police station to file a missing persons report. The desk sergeant at the police station took down the details, noting the girls' descriptions and what they had been wearing. He tried to reassure the mothers, explaining that teenagers frequently lost track of time, especially during holidays at the beach. He told them to go home and get some rest, promising that a patrol car would keep an eye out for the girls near the transit stations. But the mothers knew their daughters, and they knew this was not normal behavior. They returned to their dark houses, sitting by the telephone all night long, jumping every time the wind rattled the window panes, praying for a ring that never came. The next morning, the gruesome discovery by the man and his dog shattered any hope the families had left. Within an hour of the man's frantic phone call from a nearby public booth, the desolate sand dunes of Wanda Beach were swarming with local police officers, medical examiners, and tire tracks from emergency vehicles. Detective Inspector Harry Thompson was assigned to lead the investigation, and when he arrived at the deep hollow between the dunes, the sight made him stop in his tracks. The two young girls were lying side by side, their bodies severely damaged by a large, sharp blade. The white sand around them was stained a deep, dark crimson. Inspector Thompson walked carefully around the perimeter of the hollow, keeping his eyes glued to the ground. He noticed a set of heavy, deep footprints pressed into the sand right next to the bodies, leading away from the crime scene toward the southern edge of the dunes. The stride-length grooves indicated that whoever made them had been moving at a fast pace, almost running. Thompson immediately turned and shouted for the forensic photography unit to get down into the bowl and capture the tracks before the weather changed. He knew that in a place like this, the environment was the biggest threat to the evidence. But the coastal weather was completely unforgiving. Just as the photographer began setting up his heavy tripod and adjusting his lenses, a massive gust of wind swept over the ridge of the dune. Thompson watched in absolute frustration as a thick sheet of loose, powdery sand cascaded down the slope, filling in the deep depressions of the footprints. Within seconds, the sharp edges of the tracks were smoothed out, leaving nothing but generic, shallow dents in the earth. The physical evidence was literally evaporating in front of their eyes, making it impossible to get an accurate measurement of the killer's shoe size or gait. Despite the loss of the tracks, the New South Wales police force launched what would quickly become the largest and most intensive manhunt in Australian history to that date. A special task force of dozens of detectives was assembled, and they set up a mobile command center right on the edge of the beach. Over the next several weeks, officers interviewed more than 5,000 people. They questioned lifeguards, kiosk workers, bus drivers, and anyone who had been anywhere near Cronulla on January 11th. They searched through transit records and pulled lists of every known violent offender living within a 50-mile radius. A few days into the investigation, a hot tip came into the command center. A local resident claimed they had seen a solitary man walking near the southern dunes around 2 o'clock on the day of the murders, and he appeared to be carrying a large canvas sack. Detectives quickly tracked the man down to a dilapidated fishing shack near the rocky cliffs. When they raided the property, they discovered a long, serrated hunting knife sitting on a table in the kitchen. The blade was covered in dark, sticky stains that looked exactly like dried blood. The man was immediately handcuffed and brought into the station for intense questioning. The fisherman was completely terrified, shaking violently as Inspector Thompson leaned across the table and demanded to know why he was in the dune. The man insisted he was completely innocent, explaining that he spent his days poaching flathead fish along the isolated sections of the coast. He claimed the dark stains on his hunting knife were just fish blood from his morning catch. Now the forensic laboratory rushed the knife through testing, and 48 hours later, the results confirmed the man was telling the truth. The stains were entirely non-human, and his employer at the fish market confirmed he had been on the docks for the rest of the day. About 3 weeks later, the investigation took another wild turn when a 22-year-old man walked directly into the police headquarters in downtown Sydney. He looked completely disheveled, his clothes torn and his eyes bloodshot. He sat down across from a desk officer and calmly stated that he wanted to confess to the Wanda Beach murders. He told the officer that a voice in his head had ordered him to go to the beach that day and find a sacrifice. The detectives were ecstatic, believing they had finally broken the case that was gripping the entire nation. They immediately moved him into a secure interrogation room. But as the interrogation progressed, Inspector Thompson began to notice serious holes in the young man's story. When asked what the girls had been wearing, the man described bright red swimsuits, but Marianne and Christine had actually been wearing casual cotton dresses. He also could not describe the specific layout of the sand dunes or where the bodies had been left. So, investigators checked his background and discovered a long history of severe psychiatric illness and a habit of confessing to high-profile crimes for attention. They verified that on January 11th, he was actually confined to a hospital on the other side of the country. As the months rolled into years, the massive pile of tips began to dwindle, and the task force was eventually downsized. The police had looked at thousands of suspects, including transient laborers, beach vagrants, and even notorious serial criminals from other states, but they continually hit a brick wall. There were no fingerprints on the victim's clothing because the loose sand had rubbed against the fabric for hours, scouring away any trace oils. There was no murder weapon, and the shifting landscape had ensured that any other physical clues were buried deep beneath tons of white sand, leaving the case completely cold. The realization eventually set in that the phantom killer of Wanda Beach had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a scar on the community that would never truly heal. The files were placed into heavy metal cabinets in the basement of the archive building where they would sit for decades, occasionally reviewed by new generations of detectives hoping for a modern forensic breakthrough. Based on the angle of the blade strikes the initial position of the victims and the layout of the desolate hollow between the sandhills, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on that afternoon. The killer is walking through the blinding sandstorm, his eyes squinted against the stinging dust. He is deeply familiar with the vast labyrinthine layout of the dunes, knowing that once you step off the main shoreline and move a few hundred yards inland, you are completely invisible to the rest of the world. The howling of the wind is deafening, masking the sound of his heavy boots sinking into the loose earth. He reaches the sharp crest of a high ridge and looks down into a deep, protected bowl in the sand. There, sitting close together with their backs against the steep slope to block the wind, are two young girls. They are completely off guard, sharing their lunch and talking over the whistling noise of the gale, completely unaware of the figure looming above them. The killer doesn't hesitate. He slides silently down the sandy bank, pulling a heavy, sharp knife from the inside pocket of his jacket. The girls hear the sudden rustle of sand shifting directly behind them and turn around, their smiles instantly evaporating as they see a massive stranger standing over them with a weapon. They open their mouths to scream for help, but the brutal wind carries their voices away into the empty wilderness, completely out of earshot from the crowds. He moves with fast, calculated precision, overtaking them before they can even scramble to their hands and knees. When the quiet hollow falls completely still, the killer stands up panting heavily as the wind whips his hair across his face. He looks down at his hands, then kneels in the loose dirt. Using his bare fingers, he frantically scoops up armfuls of the dry white sand, tossing it over the motionless forms in a desperate, rushed attempt to hide his work from the world. Then he turns and walks away into the storm, letting the relentless shifting dunes completely erase his footsteps behind him. Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sherrock never made it back to their families on that hot January day, and the person responsible for ending their young lives was never brought to justice. Despite decades of intense investigation, thousands of detailed interviews, and countless theories that continue to circulate through Australia to this very day, the identity of the killer remains a total mystery. The vast moving dunes of Wanda Beach are still there, constantly changing shape with every passing seasonal storm, holding on to the secrets of that afternoon, 61 years ago, serving as a quiet reminder of how quickly a normal day can vanish. The memory of the girls is still preserved in the old police files tucked away in the dark corners of the archive, while the coastal winds continue to reshape the landscape outside. But sometimes mysteries do not stay buried in the sand forever and years later, across a completely different stretch of water. Another community would find itself waking up to a sudden explosion of violence that would change their perception of safety overnight. In December of 1962, the neighborhood of Remuera in Auckland, New Zealand, was the kind of place where doctors, lawyers, and wealthy business owners lived. Neighbors walked down the wide, clean sidewalks, greeting each other by name, and kids played on the manicured lawns until the street lamps flickered on. Milk delivery vans would roll through the streets early in the morning, leaving bottles on front porches without anyone ever worrying about theft. Major Crime X simply did not exist here, and the local police force spent most of their time dealing with minor traffic violations, noise complaints, or lost property. But inside a large, multi-story house on Bassett Road, a man named George Walker was running a secret business that his wealthy neighbors knew absolutely nothing about. You see, back in the 1960s, New Zealand had incredibly strict laws regarding alcohol sales, forcing every pub and bar in the country to close its doors by 6 o'clock in the evening. This created a massive national phenomenon known as the 6 o'clock swill, where working men would rush from their jobs and try to drink as much beer as humanly possible in just 1 hour before closing time. This left thousands of people completely desperate for a proper relaxed drink later in the evening, and George was one of the top operators who capitalized on this demand. He had turned his rented home on Bassett Road into a high-end sly grog shop, which was basically an illegal hidden speakeasy. Wealthy clients, gang members, and underworld figures would show up at his door in the middle of the night, ready to pay double for bottles of whiskey gin and beer. George ran the house with his close associate, a 32-year-old man named Kevin Spate, who helped manage the inventory, pour drinks, and watch the door. The house was heavily carpeted with thick velvet drapes covering every single window to ensure that no light or sound could leak out into the quiet suburban street outside. Inside, the living room was filled with plush leather armchairs, expensive crystal glasses, and thousands of dollars worth of premium liquor stacked inside hidden wall panels behind bookshelves. To the rest of the world, George and Kevin were just quiet residents who kept to themselves, but to the Auckland underworld, they were sitting on an absolute gold mine. On the morning of December 7th, 1962, a local courier who regularly did business with George walked up the concrete path toward the front door of the Bassett Road house. He had a scheduled meeting with George to drop off several crates of illicit spirits, and he was checking his watch because he knew George hated when people were late during daylight hours. When he reached the wooden porch, he noticed that the heavy front door was slightly unlatched, swaying back and forth in the cool morning breeze. He knocked softly against the wood, but nobody answered. He called out George's name into the gap, but the only sound coming from inside was the faint rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. So the man pushed the door open and stepped inside, and right away he knew something was wrong. The hallway was completely dark, and the air in the house felt thick and heavy. There was a distinct, sharp, metallic smell of copper, mixed with the scent of stale cigarette smoke hanging in the air. He walked slowly down the corridor. his boots clicking loudly against the hardwood floorboards, noticing that a couple of coats had been knocked off their pegs onto the ground. He rounded the corner into the front living room and his heart completely dropped. George Walker was slumped on his side next to a leather couch, his clothes shredded, and his body resting in a massive, dark red pool of fluid that had soaked deep into the expensive carpet. Just a few feet away, Kevin Spate was propped up against the wall, his head tilted back, and his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. The room was completely systematically destroyed. The armchairs were flipped over glass shards from broken crystal decanters crunched beneath his feet, and a heavy wooden coffee table was split completely down the middle from the impact of multiple high-velocity projectiles. The man stumbled backward out of the house screaming and ran frantically down the sidewalk to the nearest public telephone booth to dial the emergency operator. Within 20 minutes, the quiet neighborhood of Remuera was flooded with police cruisers, detectives, and forensic investigators. The chief of the Auckland Criminal Division took charge of the scene, and as he walked through the living room, he was completely baffled by what he was looking at. New Zealand had an incredibly low homicide rate at the time, and almost every murder in the country's history had been committed with a knife, a blunt object, or a standard hunting shotgun during a domestic dispute. As the police cordoned off the property with yellow tape, residents of Bassett Road gathered at the edges of their lawns, staring in absolute disbelief. Women stood in their dressing gowns, and men forgot to grab their morning newspapers as they watched body bags being carried out of the house. The realization that a violent underworld operation had been running right next to their families was deeply unsettling. The detective inspector knew he had to get answers quickly before panic completely overtook the wealthy suburb. But the injuries on George and Kevin were entirely different. Their bodies had been riddled with dozens of entry wounds, and the walls of the lounge were peppered with small, clean holes that went deep into the plaster. As the forensic team began digging into the walls with hammers, chisels, and pliers, they started pulling out heavy, slug-like metal projectiles. When the lead ballistics expert examined the brass shell casings scattered across the floorboards, he realized they were .45 caliber rounds. This meant the killer had not used a common pistol or a hunting rifle. They had used an automatic submachine gun. Now, this realization sent massive shockwaves through the entire police department because automatic weapons were completely unheard of in New Zealand domestic crimes. The ballistics team identified the specific weapon as a Rising submachine gun, a military-grade firearm manufactured in the United States during World War II. The police had to face the reality that a highly organized, heavily armed element was now operating in their quiet country, and they immediately launched a massive, unprecedented investigation into the Auckland underworld to find out where this weapon had come from. The ballistics team spent hours analyzing the Rising gun's mechanism once it was brought to the lab. They discovered that this particular weapon had been smuggled into the country off a foreign cargo ship months earlier. The Rising gun was notoriously complex with a unique blowback system that fired from a closed bolt, making it highly accurate but devastatingly lethal at close range. Finding such a specialized military weapon in Auckland meant that the local criminals were no longer just petty thieves. They were importing weapons of war. Detectives began raiding every known illegal gambling den, sly grog house, and dockside warehouse in the city, dragging in dozens of small-time criminals and bookmakers for questioning. They pored over George Walker's business ledgers, looking for any names of clients who owed large debts or rivals who wanted to shut his operation down. Within a few days, whispers began to circulate through the smoke-filled back rooms of pool halls near the Auckland harbor about a brutal new syndicate that was trying to establish total control over the city's after-hours alcohol trade. A week into the investigation, a confidential informant walked into the detective inspector's office, looking incredibly nervous and constantly glancing over his shoulder at the door. He had been picked up on a minor burglary charge and offered information in exchange for his freedom because he was terrified that the shooters would find out he knew about their plan. He sat down and told the inspector that he knew exactly who had brought the .45 caliber Rising submachine gun into Auckland. He said that a few weeks prior, two ruthless underworld enforcers had been bragging about how they were going to shake down George Walker for a massive cut of his Bassett Road profits, and if George refused to pay, they were going to eliminate him permanently. The informant gave the police two names that sent an immediate shock through the detectives. The first was Ron Jorgensen, a hardened criminal with a long record of assault and armed robbery, and the second was John Gillies, a cold, calculating enforcer who was known to handle the syndicate's dirty work. The informant also provided a specific address for a small, isolated cabin located on the rural outskirts of Auckland, surrounded by tall trees, where he claimed the two men were hiding out waiting for the media attention to die down. Armed with this new information, a heavily armed tactical squad surrounded the isolated cabin in the middle of the night. They smashed through the front door, catching both men completely by surprise before they could even reach for the weapons sitting on the bedside table. The police launched a meticulous search of the property, pulling up floorboards, ripping open mattresses, and digging up the muddy earth in the backyard. Underneath a loose plank in the kitchen floor, wrapped tightly in a grease-stained canvas bag, detectives uncovered the .45 caliber Rising submachine gun, along with several fully loaded magazines. When Ron Jorgensen and John Gillies were brought into the police station, they initially refused to speak, sitting in their chairs with blank expressions and folded arms. They sneered at the detectives, confident that the lack of eyewitnesses would protect them from prosecution. But when the detective inspector laid the canvas bag and the Rising submachine gun onto the steel table, their demeanor instantly changed. The ballistics matching the bullets inside the walls to this specific weapon provided an unshakable link to the crime scene. Based on witness testimonies, ballistics reports, and police interrogation logs, here is a reconstruction of what happened inside the house on Bassett Road on the night of December 6, 1962. Late that evening, the two enforcers pull their car up to the curb a few houses down from 11 Bassett Road, keeping the headlights completely turned off to avoid attracting the attention of the neighbors. The driver reaches into the back seat and pulls out a heavy canvas bag, unzipping it to reveal the cold, metallic frame of the Rising submachine gun. He slaps a loaded magazine into the mag well and pulls back the charging handle, chambering a .45 caliber round with a loud mechanical click. The passenger adjusts his leather gloves, checks his own pistol, and nods. They step out into the cool night air and walk quickly up the concrete path toward the house. They knock on the door using a specific rhythm that George Walker uses for his premium clients. Inside, George hears the knock and assumes it is just another wealthy customer looking to buy expensive bottles of whiskey after the pubs have closed. He walks down the hallway, slides back the heavy deadbolt, and opens the door wide. Before he can even utter a word of greeting, the two enforcers push their way past him, shoving him roughly down the corridor and into the front lounge, where Kevin Spate is sitting in a leather armchair. The driver raises the submachine gun, pointing the barrel directly at George's chest, and demands to know where the cash safe is located. George, who is notoriously non-confrontational but fiercely protective of his business, refuses to answer and steps forward to try and grab the barrel of the weapon. The driver doesn't hesitate. He squeezes the trigger, and the submachine gun erupts with a rapid-fire roar that completely fills the small room. The muzzle flashes, lighting up the dark wallpaper. Dozens of heavy .45 caliber slugs rip through George's torso, throwing his body backward onto the carpet. Kevin Spate leaps out of his armchair to try and run for the back exit, but the shooter quickly pivots and unleashes another devastating burst of automatic fire. The rounds tear into Kevin, pinning him against the wall before he collapses onto the floorboards. The room falls completely quiet except for the heavy panting of the two enforcers and the smell of burning gunpowder. They quickly ransack the hidden wall panels, grab a few stacks of cash, and sprint out the front door, leaving the house completely wide open. After sprinting out the front door, the two men drove frantically toward the outskirts of the city, throwing their blood-stained leather jackets into a deep drainage ditch along the highway. They cleaned the submachine gun with oil to remove any latent fingerprints before wrapping it back in the canvas bag. They believed that by burying the weapon beneath the cabin floorboards, they had effectively buried the only piece of evidence that could ever connect them to the Bassett Road house. In 1963, Ron Jorgensen and John Gillies stood trial in a media-frenzied courtroom that completely captivated the entire nation. Both men were found guilty of double homicide and were sentenced to life imprisonment in New Zealand's maximum security prison system. This event permanently altered the country's perception of its own safety, proving that no nation was completely immune to the violent realities of organized crime syndicates. And while the community on Bassett Road slowly tried to move past the violence thousands of miles away, across the freezing and unforgiving expanses of the open ocean, a completely different group of men were about to face a battle for survival that would push the limits of human endurance to the absolute edge. In the middle of January of 1960, 21-year-old Askat Zagantian stood on the frozen metal deck of a small Soviet military vessel called the T-36, wrapping his thick wool coat tighter around his shoulders to block out the biting gale blowing off the sea. The vessel was anchored in a small, rocky bay just off the coast of Iterup Island, which was a remote, rugged volcanic rock in the Kuril chain stretching between the Kamchatka Peninsula and Japan. Now, the T-36 was not a grand warship or a sophisticated submarine. It was just a 50-foot unpowered mooring barge. Basically, a giant floating steel box used by the military to transport fuel-building materials and heavy crates from larger transport ships directly to the rocky shore. Along with Askat, 3 other young Soviet soldiers were stationed on board: Philip Poplavsky, Anatoly Kryushkovsky, and Ivan Fedotov. They were just ordinary conscripts, young boys from small rural villages who had been drafted into the army and sent to one of the most isolated, desolate outposts on the entire planet, counting down the days until their service was over. Their daily routine below deck was defined by heavy manual labor cold grease and the constant deafening clanging of the northern Pacific swells slamming against the thick steel hull. Inside, the tiny cramped crew quarters, situated right in the belly of the barge, there was a small coal-burning stove that provided just enough heat to keep their fingers from turning blue, a rough wooden table bolted to the floor, and 4 narrow bunks stacked against the metal ribs of the vessel. The men spent their hours checking heavy steel cables, chipping thick ice off the deck plates, and maintaining the barge's small auxiliary engine, which was only intended to operate a heavy bilge pump, not to propel the massive box through the water. So they were completely dependent on their heavy mooring lines to stay safely attached to the coastal station on the island. On this particular week, the sky had turned a dark, bruised shade of gray, and the ocean was turning into a chaotic mass of whitecaps. But the 4 soldiers didn't feel any alarm because severe winter storms were a completely normal part of life in the Kuril Islands. But on the evening of January 17, 1960, an exceptionally brutal Arctic cyclone descended directly onto the bay, bringing with it 70-knot winds and mountainous waves that completely swallowed the surrounding cliffs. The 4 young soldiers were suddenly shaken from their sleep around midnight by a piercing, deafening metallic screech that vibrated through the entire structure like an explosion. Askat scrambled up the iron ladder, pushed open the heavy hatch against the driving snow, and realized that their massive steel mooring cables had snapped cleanly under the immense pressure of the current. He screamed down the hatch for the others to start the small auxiliary engine, hoping they could use the bilge pump system or any mechanical leverage to push the barge closer to the sandy shallows. But the tiny engine was completely useless. Against the fury of the storm, the wind caught the flat vertical sides of the T-36, treating the heavy box like a massive steel sail, and began dragging them rapidly away from the safety of the harbor out into the pitch-black expanse of the open Pacific Ocean. By the time a pale sun broke through the storm clouds the following morning, the Kuril Islands had completely vanished from the horizon, replaced by a flat, ominous circle of freezing spray and gray water. The soldiers rushed to the small radio compartment to call the base for immediate rescue, but, to their shock, they found the small transmitter unit was entirely destroyed. Its delicate glass vacuum tubes shattered into hundreds of pieces by the violent rocking of the vessel during the night. They were completely invisible to the world, drifting blindly south into some of the most deserted shipping lanes in the entire world. Back on Iterup Island, the military commanders searched the immediate coastline as soon as the storm died down. But after discovering a few broken wooden planks and an empty torn life raft washed up on the jagged rocks near the bay, they officially concluded that the T-36 had capsized in the freezing swells and sank to the bottom, and all 4 young soldiers were listed as officially dead in the military registries. Completely unaware that their own country had already given up on them and written them off, Askat gathered the 3 other men around the wooden table in the galley to perform a meticulous inventory of their emergency provisions. The results were absolutely devastating to the young soldiers, because the barge was only used for short, routine coastal transfers that lasted a few hours. It was many times never stocked with survival rations or long-term food supplies. They found a few pounds of loose, dirty potatoes rolling around in the bottom of a metal bin, a single loaf of stale rye bread, a small tin containing cooking fat, and about 1 gallon of fresh water left in a small, rusted metal container. That was absolutely everything they had to sustain 4 grown, hard-working men in the middle of a freezing ocean. Askat looked at the meager pile of food, kept his voice completely steady to avoid causing a panic, and explained that they would have to implement a severe extreme rationing system if they wanted to stay alive long enough for a passing cargo ship to spot them. For the first 3 weeks of their drift, the men established a robotic, grueling schedule to preserve their sanity and their bodies. Each day, Askat would use a small pocket knife to cut a razor-thin slice of potato and a tiny crumb of the stale rye bread for each man, followed by a single thimbleful of the rusty water. The hunger quickly became a constant burning fire in their stomachs, but the intense cold was an even greater threat to their survival. The uninsulated steel walls of the barge acted exactly like a commercial freezer, drawing out every single ounce of their body heat, and a thick white layer of frost began to grow along the interior ceiling. To keep the tiny coal stove burning after their fuel supply ran out, the men had to make the agonizing choice to begin chopping up their own living quarters. They used a small hand axe to break apart the wooden privacy screens, then the spare bunks, and eventually the very wooden floorboards they walked on, burning the small splinters one by one just to melt ice and boil their tiny daily allotment of water. By the middle of February, the situation had deteriorated into something completely nightmarish. The stale bread and the shriveled potatoes were entirely gone, and the men had been drifting for nearly a month without seeing a single sign of human life on the water. Their skin turned a sickly, translucent yellow shade. Their teeth began to loosen in their gums from scurvy, and their muscles had wasted away to the point where their clothes hung loosely off their skeletal frames. It required a massive, agonizing physical effort just to stand up from their blankets and climb the iron ladder to scan the empty gray horizon for a passing ship. When the final drop of fresh water in their container was completely gone, the soldiers had to resort to cutting the metal pipes of the auxiliary engine's cooling system, draining out a dark, murky fluid that tasted heavily of iron rust and toxic machine oil, filtering the sludge through a dirty rag before forcing themselves to swallow it, just to keep their throats from swelling shut. So when the 23rd day of February arrived, the four soldiers were facing absolute starvation, having gone days without a single calorie entering their systems. It was during this week that the young men reached a profound turning point, a moment where the absolute primal instinct to survive forced them to look at the ordinary, inanimate objects inside the cabin in a completely different way. Askat's eyes happened to fall upon a pair of heavy leather military boots sitting underneath an empty bunk, and he suddenly remembered that genuine leather was processed animal hide, which meant it still contained base organic fibers, proteins, and fats. He pulled the heavy boot toward him, his hand shaking so violently from profound weakness that he could barely grip the handle of his pocket knife, and began to carefully slice the thick leather upper into tiny narrow strips about the size of shoelaces. And then the four men, huddled closely around the dying heat of the stove, placed the stiff leather strips into a small tin filled with the oily engine water and boiled them for over 3 hours. The air inside the small steel cabin quickly became filled with a foul, choking odor of burning boot polish, residual wax, and boiling animal skin. But the soldiers just stared into the pot, watching the water bubble. When the leather strips finally softened into a rubbery consistency, Askat took the very first piece, placed it into his mouth, and began to chew. It was incredibly tough, tasting heavily of bitter chemical tanning agents and old grease. But they chewed each piece for hours, until it was soft enough to slide down their throats without causing them to choke or vomit. Over the next 10 days, the men systematically consumed every single piece of leather on the barge, slicing up their belts, their extra boots, a small bar of shaving soap they found in a kit, and eventually, the thick leather strap of an accordion that Ivan had brought along to play songs during their cold nights on the island. But by the first week of March, every scrap of leather had been completely consumed, and the four soldiers entered the absolute final stages of human starvation. They spent nearly 24 hours a day, lying perfectly still in their remaining wooden bunks, wrapped tightly in heavy wool blankets, trying to save every single heartbeat and prevent their organs from shutting down completely. Their thoughts became slow, hazy, and completely fragmented, and they began to experience vivid, agonizing hallucinations of their childhood homes, massive wooden tables overflowing with fresh food, and the sound of clear, running water in the streams of their villages. Ivan Fedotov was in the most critical condition of all, his pulse slowing down to a faint, erratic flutter, and his breath coming in shallow, raspy gasps that rattled through the freezing silence of the dark cabin. The other three men could do nothing but crawl over to his bunk, hold his cold hands, and wait for the inevitable end to arrive. Then, on the morning of March 7th, 1960, which marked the 49th day of their incredible, grueling ordeal, Askat thought he heard a distant, rhythmic thumping noise, echoing directly through the steel deck plates above his head. He assumed it was just another auditory hallucination, his mind playing tricks on him as his brain began to lose oxygen, but the sound grew steadily louder and more mechanical, a distinct chopping noise that vibrated the frozen air inside the room. Summoning every last shred of physical strength left in his skeletal body, Askat dragged himself out of his bunk, crawled on his hands and knees across the icy floorboards and pulled his weight up the wooden steps to push open the heavy metal hatch. He collapsed onto the snowy deck, blinking blindly against the sudden piercing glare of the sun. When his vision finally cleared, he saw a massive, unbelievable shape hovering just 50 feet directly above the barge. It was a massive military helicopter with a bright white star insignia painted on its side, its enormous rotor blades whipping up a furious storm of ocean spray that rained down across the metal deck. Just behind the helicopter, cutting through the heavy gray swells of the open Pacific, was an enormous American aircraft carrier called the USS Kearsarge. Despite the extreme volatile height of Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, the American lookouts on the carrier had spotted the tiny rusted box of the T-36 drifting aimlessly in the water over one, quote, 1,000 miles away from the frozen bay where it had originally been carried out to sea. Two American rescue swimmers quickly lowered themselves down from the helicopter onto the deck of the barge, and when they stepped inside the dark cabin, they were completely shocked and stunned by the sight before them. They saw three emaciated, hollow-cheeked figures lying motionless in the bunks, their skin clinging so tightly to their bones that they looked more like ancient mummies than living soldiers. The Americans immediately wrapped the four young men in heavy thermal blankets, strapped them into rescue litters, and hoisted them up into the hovering helicopters, leaving the empty, rusted shell of the T-36 to slowly sink beneath the waves. Once on board the USS Kearsarge, the ship's medical team rushed the four Soviet soldiers into a secure, sterile isolation ward, knowing that giving them a large meal after 49 days of total starvation would cause their S-press's internal organs to fail, a condition known as refeeding syndrome. So for the first 48 hours, the American sailors meticulously fed the soldiers nothing but small spoonfuls of warm broth, medical glucose solutions, and tiny sips of pure water every single hour, slowly nursing their bodies back from the edge of death. The American crew treated the young conscripts with profound respect and kindness, washing their tattered clothes, providing them with clean Navy uniforms, and sitting by their bedsides to ensure they remained stable. The miraculous survival of the T-36 crew became an overnight international sensation, dominating front pages in both Washington and Moscow, briefly freezing the intense geopolitical hostility of the Cold War era. On March 15, 1960, the four soldiers were officially discharged from the carrier's hospital and flown to San Francisco, where they were given a massive hero's welcome before boarding a transatlantic flight back to the Soviet Union. Upon their arrival in Moscow, Askat Ziganshin, Philippe Poplavsky, Anatoly Kryuchkovsky, and Ivan Fedotov were awarded the prestigious Order of the Red Star by the government for their unyielding military discipline and courage. The four men eventually returned to their ordinary civilian lives, carrying the deep physical and mental scars of their 49 days on the water, proving that the human body can endure the absolute impossible when there is nothing left to hold on to. And as the four young men finally stepped off the train platform into the arms of their weeping mothers, the gathered crowds roared with celebration. Completely unaware that across the world, on a completely different continent, another mystery was quietly taking shape in the desert, where a completely sober police officer would abandon a routine traffic stop to investigate a distant explosion, only to come face to face with an object that would leave the military completely baffled. On the afternoon of November 17, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller stood on the muddy banks of a wide river mouth in Netherlands, New Guinea, helping his companion balance a massive, awkwardly shaped wooden carving across the deck of their custom boat. Michael was wearing a pair of old, mud-splattered khaki trousers, a loose cotton shirt, and thick, heavy-rimmed glasses that were constantly fogging up in the intense, sticky humidity of the tropical coast. He was accompanied by René Wassing, a 34-year-old Dutch anthropologist who had been sent by the government to assist him in navigating the local territory. The air around them was thick with the heavy scent of rotting vegetation and low-tide silt, and the only sound for miles was the constant low drone of millions of insects nesting deep within the nearby mangrove roots. Michael was not sitting in a comfortable air-conditioned office in Manhattan, despite being the son of Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York and the heir to one of the most powerful family fortunes in the world. Instead, he had spent the last several months sleeping on the floors of communal longhouses, eating smoked sago palm starch, and wading through waist-deep swamps to trade steel axe heads and rolls of strong tobacco leaves for the ceremonial art of the Asmat people. Now, Michael had become completely obsessed with the complex, intricate wooden sculptures created by the local craftsmen, particularly the massive ceremonial poles that stood over 10 feet tall and were carved to honor the spirits of deceased relatives. He believed that this art was some of the most profound and expressive work on the face of the earth, and his dream was to collect enough pieces to fill an entire wing of the Museum of Primitive Art back in New York City. To travel between the isolated coastal settlements that were separated by a vast network of volatile rivers and dense, muddy swamps, Michael had purchased 2 long, narrow dugout canoes from a local village. He had hired a team of native carpenters to lay a wide wooden platform across the top of both hulls, effectively creating a makeshift catamaran that could carry heavy loads of cargo. He bolted a small 20-horsepower outboard motor to the wooden stern, believing that this custom craft would give them the freedom to explore the entire coastline with ease. But on this particular afternoon, as they prepared to head out toward the southern village of Agates, the sky began to turn a dark, heavy shade of gray, and the water at the mouth of the river was turning into a chaotic mass of short, steep waves. And as soon as they steered the heavily loaded catamaran out into the open water, where the strong river current collided directly with the ocean tide, the limitations of their makeshift boat became apparent. The extra weight of the massive wooden poles and shields caused the 2 dugout hulls to sit incredibly low in the water, and with every passing wave, a thick sheet of salty spray washed completely across the deck, soaking their supplies and filling the open cavities of the canoes. The 2 local guides Michael had hired to help navigate the channels began to look visibly concerned, pointing out that the cross currents in this section of the coast were notoriously unpredictable. But the outboard motor was humming steadily, and Michael was eager to reach their next destination before nightfall. Suddenly, a massive wave slammed directly into the side of the catamaran, lifting the port canoe into the air and throwing the entire craft at a dangerous angle. The 20-horsepower motor let out a loud mechanical sputter as water flooded the open carburetor, and then it died completely, leaving the heavy steel and wood structure completely at the mercy of the strong outgoing current. So within a matter of minutes, the catamaran began to drift rapidly away from the shore, drawn out into the deep water by the force of the tide. Michael and Renee immediately grabbed empty plastic buckets and began frantically scooping water out of the submerged canoes, but the waves were coming too fast, filling the hulls faster than the men could work. Before long, the weight of the water flipped the entire platform upside down, dumping the 4 men and their heavy carvings into the sea. They managed to scramble onto the slippery, smooth underside of the overturned platform, gripping the wet wood as the wind began to pick up, driving the cold spray directly into their eyes. The 2 local guides looked at the shrinking line of green mangroves on the horizon and realized that if they stayed with the floating wreck, they would be carried out into the deep ocean where survival was impossible. They turned to Michael, shouted that they would swim to the shore to bring back a rescue party, and then they dove into the water, disappearing into the gray waves. Michael and Renee were left completely alone on the slick wooden platform as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the ocean into absolute darkness. They spent 14 hours clinging to the dead motor and the wooden frames, their muscles cramping violently from the cold and their skin burning from the constant friction of the salt crust. Michael kept a constant watch on the dark horizon, hoping to see the searchlights of a government vessel, but there was only the sound of the ocean slamming against the wood. By the time the morning sun broke through the heavy sea haze on November 18th, the catamaran had drifted an estimated 3 to 10 miles away from the coast. The shoreline was barely visible, appearing as a faint, blurred green line through the thick morning mist. Michael looked at Renee, his face pale and his lips blue from the early stages of hypothermia, and stated that he didn't think the rescue party would be able to locate them this far out at sea. He pointed down at 2 empty, red plastic jerry cans that had broken loose from their straps and were bobbing up and down in the water right next to the platform. Michael reached out, pulled the 2 empty jerry cans toward him, and shook them to ensure that there was no residual fuel left inside the plastic chambers. He took a long piece of thick nylon rope from the dead motor, wrapped it tightly around his waistband several times, and then secured each end to the plastic handles of the cans, creating a makeshift buoyancy belt that would keep his shoulders above the water. Renee tried to argue with him, pointing out that the coastal currents were incredibly powerful and that swimming several miles through waters known to be populated by massive sharks and crocodiles was an extreme risk for an exhausted man. But Michael was determined to take control of his own survival. He looked at his companion, adjusted his grip on the red plastic handles, and said, "I think I can make it." Then he slid off the edge of the overturned platform into the gray water and began swimming steadily toward the distant shore using a slow, rhythmic breaststroke. Renee watched from the platform as the two red dots bobbed up and down on the swells, growing smaller and smaller until they completely vanished into the morning fog. Late that afternoon, a Dutch maritime patrol boat that had been deployed after the two local guides finally reached the shore, spotted the overturned catamaran drifting far out in the shipping lanes. The crew pulled a severely dehydrated, barely conscious Renee Wassing from the wood, but there was no sign of Michael Rockefeller anywhere in the surrounding sea. The news of the missing billionaire heir triggered a massive, unprecedented search operation that completely dominated international headlines for weeks. Nelson Rockefeller immediately chartered a private plane and flew directly to the remote territory, bringing with him a massive army of journalists, investigators, and family staff. The Dutch government mobilized naval vessels, thousands of soldiers, and low-flying military aircraft to search every single bay and estuary along the coast. Helicopters hovered just above the tree line, their searchlights cutting through the dense canopy, while hundreds of local Asmat warriors in long dugout canoes paddled through the narrow mud channels looking for any trace of the red plastic containers or the clothing Michael had been wearing. But after 2 weeks of continuous intensive searching, the rescue teams found absolutely nothing. Not a single piece of debris, no plastic fragments, and no footprints in the thick coastal mudflats. The official investigation eventually began to wind down, and administrators put forward several theories to explain the young man's disappearance. The primary consensus among the colonial authorities was that Michael had simply succumbed to exhaustion and drowned before reaching the shore, his body carried away into the deep ocean by the powerful undercurrents. Other experts pointed out that the massive river mouths were heavily infested with large saltwater crocodiles, suggesting that the young man had been taken while swimming through the open channels. With no physical evidence to prove otherwise, the official search was called off. The family returned to New York, and the case was officially closed as a tragic death by drowning at sea. But deep inside the isolated native villages tucked away in the mangrove swamps, a completely different story began to spread through the smoke-filled communal longhouses. Years after the incident, Catholic missionaries who lived permanently among the Asmat people, including a priest named Father Cornelius van Kessel, began to notice that several young men from the village of Otsjanep were in possession of strange Western items, including distinctive clothing and heavy frames that could not have been traded for. During private conversations, tribal elders confided in the priests, revealing a dark secret that had been kept hidden from the government patrols. The missionaries began writing detailed confidential reports and sending them directly to the regional Dutch administrators. But the colonial government was in the process of pulling out of the territory and chose to bury the files to avoid an international incident. It wasn't until decades later, when an investigative journalist named Carl Hoffman located the original archives and spent months living inside the village of Otsjanep, that the true nature of Michael's fate was finally brought to light, revealing that the events of November 1961 were directly tied to a violent raid that had occurred 3 years prior in 1958. You see, in 1958, a Dutch colonial officer named Max Lepre had entered the village of Otsjanep with a squad of heavily armed police to settle a violent dispute between rival clans. The sudden appearance of the soldiers caused a massive panic among the residents, and when several high-ranking village chiefs stepped forward with their wooden shields to confront the officer, the police opened fire on the crowd, shooting dead 5 of the village's most important traditional leaders. In Asmat culture, the universe is governed by a strict spiritual balance of life and death. And when a member of the tribe is killed by an outsider, their spirit remains restless, causing sickness and bad luck within the community, until a matching life is taken from the enemy's clan to balance the ledger. For 3 years, the warriors of Otsjanep had been living under the shadow of an unfulfilled blood debt against the white men who had killed their chiefs, waiting for an opportunity to restore the balance. And that opportunity arrived on a cold morning in November 1961, when a line of warriors in long canoes spotted a solitary white man floating in the thick mud near the mangrove roots. Based on confidential missionary records, local tribal logs, and declassified colonial files, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Michael Rockefeller when he reached the shore. The line of long wooden canoes slides in perfect, synchronized silence through the murky brown water near the edge of the mangrove swamp, the paddles barely breaking the surface. The warriors from the village of Otsjanep are out scanning the mudflats for fish when they notice a strange, rhythmic splashing sound coming from a narrow channel near the exposed roots. As they paddle closer, they see a white man crawling on his hands and knees through the thick black mud. He is completely naked, except for a pair of wet undergarments, and his skin is covered in hundreds of deep scratches from the sharp marsh grass. He has 2 empty red plastic jerry cans tied to his waist with a length of rope, and he is so physically exhausted from swimming for nearly 24 hours that he cannot even lift his head to look at the approaching boats collapsing. Forward into the wet earth to gasp for air. The canoes quickly form a circle around the struggling man, and several young warriors step out into the knee-deep mud, their long wooden spears held at their sides. They look down at the helpless stranger, and one of the older men instantly recognizes him as the wealthy white man who had been visiting the nearby settlements to buy their wooden carvings. But as they stand there in the silence, a young warrior named Ajik steps forward, his face completely expressionless. Ajik's uncle had been one of the traditional chiefs shot dead by the Dutch police officer during the massacre of 1958, and for 3 years his family had been carrying the spiritual burden of that unpaid debt. He looks at the other men in the circle, points his finger at the exhausted man in the mud, and states that this is their chance to finally balance the spirits of their dead ancestors. The other warriors look around at the empty horizon, realizing that the government patrol boats are miles away and that nobody will ever see what happens inside the silent canopy of the swamp. Without saying another word, Ajik raises his heavy wooden spear and drives it directly into the white man's torso. The stranger lets out a single sharp cry of pain, his fingers clawing at the black mud for a brief second before his body goes completely limp. The other warriors immediately step forward, using their sharp bone knives to remove his clothing, his thick glasses, and the red plastic jerry cans, tossing the small western items deep into the current, where they sink into the heavy silt. They lift the body into the long canoes, paddle silently back toward the village of Otsjanep, and perform the ancient ceremonial rituals required to close the blood debt, ensuring that the restless spirits of their chiefs can finally rest. The village elders meet later that evening in the dark, swearing every single resident to absolute silence, promising that if any government official ever asks about the missing white man, they will say he was swallowed by the ocean. Currents. Michael Rockefeller's remains were never recovered, and he remains officially listed as dead by drowning in the international registries. The massive collection of Asmat art that he risked his life to secure was eventually shipped to New York, where it sits inside a secure gallery at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, thousands of miles away from the silent mangrove swamps where it was originally carved. The village of Otsjanep eventually went back to its daily routines, the secret preserved through quiet whispers from fathers to sons, buried deep within the history of colonial violence. On the afternoon of January 30th, 1962, a 14-year-old girl named Hawa sat at her wooden desk inside a classroom in the village of Kashasha, which was a remote settlement located near the shores of Lake Victoria in the country of Tanganyika. The room was hot, and the air was thick with the scent of red dust and the sharp smell of chalk from the blackboard. A missionary teacher was standing at the front of the room, slowly writing out grammar exercises, her chalk clicking rhythmically against the slate. The school was a strict, highly disciplined boarding institution run by European missionaries, where the students were expected to maintain absolute silence during their lessons, keeping their eyes fixed forward on their books. Hawa was sitting next to her 2 closest friends, 14-year-old Amina and 15-year-old Joyce, when she suddenly felt a strange sensation in her chest. It wasn't a pain or a cough, but a sudden, overwhelming urge to laugh. She tried to swallow it down, pressing her hand over her mouth and staring intently at her notebook. But the feeling was too powerful. A sharp, loud giggle escaped her lips, echoing through the silent classroom. The teacher immediately stopped writing, turned around from the blackboard, and pointed a long piece of white chalk directly at Hawa, demanding that she stand up and explain her disruptive behavior. But Hawa could not answer because she was completely unable to stop laughing. Her shoulders were shaking violently, her face was turning a deep shade of red, and tears were beginning to stream down her cheeks as she gasped for air between bursts of loud, high-pitched laughter. Amina and Joyce looked at her, initially confused by her sudden outburst, but within a matter of seconds, the exact same urge hit them as well. Joyce clutched her stomach, leaning forward over her desk as a loud chuckle burst from her throat, and then Amina joined in. Her high-pitched giggles mixing with Hawa's uncontrollable laughter until all 3 girls were shaking in their seats. The teacher walked down the narrow aisle between the desks, her face tight with anger, believing that the 3 teenagers were playing a deliberate prank or trying to start a rebellion against the school's strict code of conduct. She ordered them to leave the classroom immediately and stand out in the courtyard until they could behave properly. The 3 girls scrambled out of their chairs, their bodies trembling as they stumbled through the open doorway, but the moment they reached the dirt courtyard, their laughter changed tone. It became frantic, coming in rapid, gasping waves that made it impossible for them to stand upright. Instead of calming down in the fresh air, the girls dropped to their knees in the dirt, their hands clawing at the ground as their laughter was now interspersed with sudden fits of crying and screaming. Other students inside the surrounding classrooms began to lean out of the windows to see what was causing the commotion, watching the three girls touch their heads and thrash around on the ground. By the end of the morning, the condition had begun to spread through the rest of the school, jumping from desk to desk as more girls began to giggle, shake, and fall from their chairs in the middle of their lessons. The school headmaster, an older missionary named Mr. English, was called to the main building to handle the situation. When he stepped into the courtyard, he found 20 more girls leaning against the concrete walls, their faces flushed and their eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and panic as they laughed uncontrollably. Mr. English ordered the staff to carry the affected students to the school infirmary, believing that they might have sneaked out of the dormitories the previous night and consumed some kind of fermented fruit or local liquor that was causing a state of mass intoxication. In the infirmary, the school nurse provided the girls with cold, wet cloths for their foreheads and quiet rooms to rest, but the isolation did not have any effect. The sound of high-pitched, echoing laughter began to bounce off the concrete walls of the dormitories day and night, coming in unpredictable waves that would last for several hours before leaving the students completely exhausted and unresponsive. Within a week, the mysterious condition had infected over 95 of the 150 students enrolled at the boarding institution, completely paralyzing the school's daily operations. The young women were suffering from severe physical side effects from the constant involuntary exertion. Their abdominal muscles were incredibly sore from hours of continuous contraction. Many were complaining of intense headaches, and they were refusing to eat or drink because their throats were too tired to swallow. The teachers tried to continue with their schedules, but it was completely impossible to conduct a lesson when half of the classroom was screaming with laughter while the other half was weeping on the floor. Mr. English realized that he had completely lost control of the facility. On March 18, 1962, the school management officially decided that the only way to contain the situation was to shut down the institution entirely. They sent urgent telegrams to the parents in the surrounding districts, telling them to come and collect their daughters immediately. Trucks and old passenger vans arrived at the school gates, and the parents packed their children's metal trunks into the back. The girls boarded the vehicles, still giggling and sobbing in irregular cycles, while the missionaries watched them leave, confident that the familiar home environments would cure whatever was inside them. Hawa returned to her home village of Nshamba, which was a small agricultural community located several miles away from the boarding school. Her mother met her at the dirt road, noticing right away that her daughter looked thin, frail, and incredibly nervous. Hawa tried to sit down with her family to eat a meal of maize porridge. But before she could take a single bite, a sudden fit of giggles cut her off, and she had to leave the table to lie down on her sleeping mat. Her family watched her in silence, having no idea how to help her. But the real crisis began a few days later when a completely unexpected development occurred inside the village of Nshamba. The children and teenagers in the community who had never attended the missionary boarding school and who had spent no time in Kashasha suddenly began to exhibit the exact same uncontrollable laughing fits. A group of young boys playing near the banana groves dropped their wooden toys and began to shake with laughter, their faces contorting in confusion as they struggled to draw breath before falling onto the dirt path exactly like Hawa had done. The condition began to spread rapidly through the paths of the village, moving from the children to the young adults and parents. The local open-air markets were completely disrupted because vendors were suddenly unable to shout out the prices of their vegetables, falling behind their wooden stalls in fits of weeping and laughing that lasted for hours. The village elders called an emergency meeting at the central clearing to discuss the possibility of a spiritual curse, believing that an angry entity from the nearby forests or a rival clan had placed a bad medicine into the soil. Local traditional healers were brought into the village to perform cleansing rituals, burning special green herbs and washing the thresholds of the homes with blessed water. But the rituals had absolutely no effect on the rising numbers. The epidemic seemed to follow the social pathways of the area, jumping along trade routes and family lines from Nshamba to a second major settlement called Bukoba, and then infecting a nearby boys' middle school, where over 200 young boys were caught in the same cycle of laughing, screaming, and fainting. By the middle of May 1962, the regional colonial authorities realized that this was a public health emergency that was completely beyond the control of the local village councils. They contacted the Central Medical Research Division and requested a team of elite physicians and epidemiologists to be dispatched to the area immediately. The lead medical officer for the district, Dr. A.M. Rankin, along with his colleague Dr. P.J. Phillip, arrived in the region with crates of syringes, sterile test tubes, microscopes, and chemical analysis kits. Dr. Rankin established a temporary field laboratory inside an empty administrative building near the edge of the lake. His very first suspicion was chemical or food poisoning, specifically focusing on the agricultural supply of the region. He suspected that a toxic fungus or mold, known as ergot, had infected the stored bags of grain and flour that were used to feed the students at the boarding school and the residents of the villages. Ergot mold grows on damp crops, and when humans consume it, it causes severe muscle spasms, hallucinations, and altered mental states. Rankin and his team marched into the grain stores, taking samples of the corn beans and cassava root from the school kitchen and the village markets. They spent days analyzing the dust under their microscopes, running chemical reagents through the mixtures to detect the presence of toxic alkaloids. But the results came back completely clean. The food supply was perfectly safe, and there were no signs of heavy metal contamination, toxic pesticides, or spoiled organic matter anywhere in the provisions that the families were consuming. The researchers then shifted their focus to the water supply, thinking that a rare pathogen or industrial chemical had leaked into the deep ground wells. They pulled water from the school pumps and the local streams, running tests for rare bacterial strains, viral cultures, and mineral imbalances. But the water was exceptionally pure and safe to drink. The physical environment around the villages offered absolutely no explanation for the behavior of the population, leaving the medical team completely baffled as the number of cases climbed past 1,000. Out of desperation, Dr. Rankin began conducting invasive physical examinations on the affected individuals inside the hospital tents. He drew blood samples, checked pupil reflexes, and performed lumbar punctures to extract cerebrospinal fluid from the girls' spines, looking for signs of a rare neurological virus, like encephalitis or meningitis, that could be causing inflammation in the brain. But every single laboratory report returned perfectly normal results, showing no fever, no elevated white blood cell counts, and absolutely no signs of physical disease. The girls' bodies were functioning perfectly from a biological standpoint, yet they were completely helpless, trapped inside a physical response that they could not control. Dr. Rankin noted that the patients were genuinely suffering, showing signs of extreme exhaustion and physical distress. Yet their laboratory charts looked like those of healthy individuals. It was around the 70% mark of their intensive field investigation that Dr. Rankin and Dr. Phillips sat down to look at the maps of the outbreak, and they noticed a highly specific pattern that changed everything. They realized that the condition had bypassed the European teachers at the missionary school, the colonial administrators, and the medical staff who were working directly with the patients every day. If the cause had been a virus, a bacteria, or a toxic chemical in the air, the adults would have been infected as well. Instead, the condition only traveled along pathways of intense social connection, affecting groups of children, friends, and family members who shared deep emotional bonds and common daily anxieties. The medical team finally reached their official conclusion, publishing their findings as a classic massive case of mass psychogenic illness, which is commonly known as mass hysteria. They realized that the true cause of the epidemic was not a physical poison in the food or water, but an immense accumulation of psychological stress building up inside the minds of the young population. The students at the school were navigating a rigid, unfamiliar Western educational system with strict punishments while simultaneously living through the massive anxiety of their country's recent independence from colonial rule. The human brain, unable to process the intense internal tension and fear of the future, had essentially converted the emotional trauma into a physical symptom, using a simple involuntary giggle as a physical release valve that accidentally triggered a massive psychological chain reaction through the community. The epidemic slowly began to fade after 18 months of sporadic outbreaks, as the regional schools remained closed and the social networks were temporarily broken, allowing the community's collective stress levels to subside. The final reports were archived in the Central African Journal of Medicine. In 1963, Kahaply, one of the most extensive and documented medical mysteries in modern history, where the mind itself had created a physical reality that science could not cure. The classrooms in Kinshasa eventually reopened, the sound of chalk and quiet lessons returning to the wooden desks, while the families returned to their agricultural routines under the hot sun. But the human mind remains an unpredictable territory capable of generating its own responses when the weight of the world becomes too heavy to bear. Leaving behind questions that are quietly preserved in the old folders, before the focus shifts to another distant corner of the world, where an ordinary summer day would lead two teenage girls into a vast, silent wilderness of sand for which they would never return. On a crisp morning in April of 1960, a male courier rode his bicycle up the winding driveway of a grand estate in Pocking, Germany. The estate belonged to Dr. Otto Prahn, a prominent, wealthy 65-year-old physician, well known among Bavaria's high society. The courier noticed that the previous day's newspapers were still sitting in the basket by the iron gate, and the front door of the villa was shut tight with velvet drapes drawn across every window. This was unusual because Dr. Prahn's housekeeper, a 50-year-old woman named Elfriede Klue, was always meticulous about her morning routine, opening the windows early to let the mountain air circulate through the spacious rooms. The courier shrugged it off, assuming the staff was resting after a late night, and placed the letters into the slot before riding back toward the main road. A few days later, Dr. Prahn's adult son Gunther felt a distinct sense of unease when his repeated telephone calls to the villa went completely unanswered. Gunther knew his father was a man of strict discipline who checked his messages at the exact same hour every day, and it was completely unlike Elfriede to neglect the telephone. So, Gunther climbed into his car and made the short drive from Munich to Pocking to check on his father. When he arrived, he found the driveway empty and the massive house totally dark, with no lights showing through the cracks in the shutters. He walked around to the side of the building, shouting his father's name, but the only response was the rustling of the pine trees. Gunther tried the kitchen door handle and found it locked from the inside. So he drove to the local police station and asked a couple of officers to accompany him back to look inside. When the police officers arrived with Gunther, they used an iron crowbar to force open a side window, scrambling into the dark kitchen. The air inside the house felt heavy and stagnant, carrying a peculiar odor that made the officers immediately draw their service pistols as they signaled for Gunther to wait outside. They walked slowly through the grand hallway, their boots thumping loudly against the marble floorboards until they reached the doctor's private study on the ground level. One of the officers pushed open the heavy mahogany door and stopped reaching for his flashlight to cut through the shadows. There, slumped face down over his large wooden desk, was the body of Dr. Otto Prahn with a small silver pistol lying on the floorboards directly beneath his right hand. A few feet away, lying sprawled near a leather armchair, was the body of the housekeeper, Elfriede Klue. The local Pocking Police Department conducted a very brief, remarkably superficial examination of the scene that afternoon. The responding detective noted the position of the pistol near Dr. Prahn's hand and the wounds on both bodies, and he quickly formulated a simple theory. He concluded that Dr. Prahn, who had been suffering from some health issues and financial stress, had simply experienced a sudden breakdown in the middle of the night. The detective deduced that the doctor had turned the silver pistol on his loyal housekeeper, shooting her down as she tried to escape, before returning to his desk and taking his own life. Within less than 48 hours, the local authorities officially closed the file, ruling the entire incident a case of murder-suicide, and released the villa back to the family so they could arrange the funerals. But when Gunther received the official police report and began sorting through his father's personal belongings at the villa, he found it completely impossible to accept the authorities' conclusions. Gunther had spent his entire life watching his father handle difficult situations with calculated, ice-cold logic, and the idea of him turning into an irrational killer did not make sense at all. Furthermore, Gunther knew his father was an experienced marksman who owned a vast collection of fine hunting rifles and target pistols, and he was incredibly particular about firearm safety. When Gunther examined the small silver pistol found at the scene, he realized it was a cheap pocket handgun that his father had never owned and had never mentioned to anyone. He also noticed that his father's personal safe in the corner of the study was unlocked, and several folders regarding a massive real estate deal were completely missing from the shelves. Feeling entirely dismissed by the local police, Gunther decided to take matters into his own hands and hired a regarded private detective from Munich to conduct an independent investigation. The private detective arrived at the Pocking villa with cameras and a set of measuring tapes, and he began systematically reconstructing the spatial mechanics of the shooting. He examined the bullet holes in the mahogany furniture and compared them to the placement of the bodies, and right away his eyebrows went up. He noticed that there were no powder burns or singe marks on Dr. Prahn's clothing or skin, which was a critical detail because when a person takes their own life with a pocket pistol, the muzzle is held directly against the flesh, leaving unmistakable marks. The private detective also found it highly suspicious that the doctor had supposedly shot himself twice, as the initial police report mentioned 2 separate wounds to the skull. And so, armed with these detailed measurements and forensic anomalies, the private detective and Gunther marched into the office of the state prosecutor in Munich and demanded that the bodies be formally exhumed for a proper autopsy by the state's top pathologists. The prosecutor looked over the notes, realized the local police had completely botched the initial scene assessment, and signed the exhumation order. A week later, a team of laborers dug up the caskets from the cemetery under the watchful eyes of state troopers, transferring the remains directly to the Institute of Legal Medicine in Munich. As the head pathologist began his examination, the lazy murder-suicide theory completely evaporated into thin air. The autopsy shockingly revealed that Dr. Otto Prawn had been shot twice in the back of the head from a significant distance, with the trajectory of the bullets showing that the weapon was fired from the doorway of the study, a full 10 feet away from where the doctor had been sitting at his desk. This physical reality made the concept of suicide completely impossible. The housekeeper Elfriede had also been shot from behind as she faced the window, indicating that both victims had been completely caught off guard by a hidden assailant who had entered the room without making a sound. The state police immediately reopened the case as a high-profile double homicide, and a special task force of detectives was assembled to find out who had a strong enough motive to execute a prominent physician in his own home. The detectives began their investigation by digging deep into Dr. Prawn's financial records and his recent social interactions, and their attention quickly focused on a glamorous 42-year-old high society socialite named Vera Bruna. Vera was a strikingly beautiful woman who was a regular fixture at the most exclusive galas and cultural events in Munich, and she had been involved in a volatile romantic relationship with the wealthy doctor for several years. As detectives poured through the doctor's missing folders, they uncovered a binding contract regarding an enormous estate in Spain called Rocas de Almenara. Dr. Prawn had owned this incredibly valuable property, but just a few months before his death, a new clause had been added to his plan, stating that upon his passing, the full ownership of the Spanish land would transfer directly to Vera Bruna. This discovery provided Vera with a massive multi-million-mark motivation to want the doctor out of the picture as quickly as possible. When detectives brought Vera in for questioning at the Munich headquarters, she appeared completely calm, elegant, and unbothered by the gravity of the situation. She smoothly explained that she was at her luxurious apartment on the night of the murders, reading a book and listening to classical music, and claimed to have no knowledge of any violence. She insisted that Dr. Prawn had given her the Spanish property out of pure affection, and that their relationship was completely amicable. But the detectives were not buying her sophisticated routine, and they began quietly monitoring her telephone lines and tracking everyone she interacted with in the city. Before long, the wiretaps picked up a series of secretive conversations between Vera and a 60-year-old mechanic named Johann Furbach, who lived in a modest apartment on the other side of Munich. Furbach was a quiet, unassuming man who had known Vera for over a decade, and he was known to be absolutely devoted to her, often running complex personal errands for her without asking any questions. When detectives pulled Furbach's employment records and travel logs, they discovered a glaring fatal flaw in his alibi for the week of the murders. A local gas station worker near Pocking came forward and told investigators that he had seen a man matching Furbach's exact description driving a dark sedan near Dr. Prawn's villa at around midnight on the night the doctor was killed. As the state police prepared to file formal charges against Vera and Furbach, a wild, incredibly dangerous rumor began to circulate through the intelligence agencies of West Germany, throwing the entire investigation into chaos. A former business associate of Dr. Prawn came forward and secretly told the task force that the doctor's medical practice was actually just a massive front for an international arms smuggling operation. The associate claimed that Dr. Prawn had been working closely with high-level intelligence operatives to illegally trade military weapons and ammunition to rebel groups in North Africa, and that the valuable property in Spain was actually being used as a secret transshipment hub for contraband cargo. This rumor suggested that the doctor hadn't been killed over a simple real estate dispute, but had instead been executed by a professional intelligence hit squad because he had double-crossed the wrong international syndicate, and that the local Pocking police had been explicitly ordered to cover up the murders as a suicide. Despite the intense political pressure and the swirling rumors of international espionage, the state prosecutor decided to focus strictly on the concrete, verifiable physical evidence and brought Vera Brun and Johann Furbach to trial in 1962. The courtroom in Munich became a massive media sensation, with hundreds of journalists from across Europe packing the gallery every morning to catch a glimpse of the glamorous socialite in the dock. The prosecutor presented the missing contracts, the gas station workers' testimony, and the undeniable ballistics reports proving the shots were fired from a distance. After a sensational, month-long trial that captivated the entire country, the jury found both defendants guilty of double homicide, and the judge sentenced Vera Brun and Johann Furbach to consecutive life terms in prison. Based on the extensive forensic measurements, ballistics tracking, and court testimonies, Here is a reconstruction of what the authorities believe actually happened outside and inside the Pocking Villa on that night in April of 1960. Around 11 o'clock in the evening, a dark sedan pulls over onto the grass shoulder of the narrow road, a few hundred yards away from Dr. Prawn's estate, its headlights clicking off in the darkness. A figure dressed in dark clothing steps out of the driver's seat, grips a small silver pocket pistol inside his jacket pocket, and walks silently along the perimeter of the iron fence until he reaches a low section of the hedge. He slips through the branches onto the manicured lawn, his boots making no sound against the wet grass as he approaches the side of the grand villa. He finds the latch of a small laundry room window is slightly loose, uses a thin blade to slide the lock open, and carefully scrambles into the dark interior of the house, stopping to listen for any sound from the upper floor. The house is completely silent except for the low hum of the grandfather clock in the central hallway. The intruder moves slowly down the corridor, his hand resting on the silver pistol, until he sees a warm glow of light spilling out from the bottom of the mahogany door of the study. He pushes the door open just a few inches and sees Dr. Otto Prawn sitting in his leather chair, his back completely turned to the doorway as he focuses on a thick stack of contracts on his desk. The intruder steps into the room, raises the pocket pistol with a steady hand, and fires 2 quick shots in rapid succession. The heavy bullets strike the doctor in the back of the head, and his body immediately slumps forward across the wooden desk, knocking over a container of ink. Before the smoke can even clear from the air, the door to the adjoining hallway flings open, and the housekeeper, Elfriede Klue, runs into the room, her eyes wide with shock as she takes in the scene. She instantly turns toward the large bay window to scream for help, but the intruder pivots quickly and pulls the trigger one more time. The final round hits her directly in the back, and she collapses onto her back near the leather armchair, her breathing stopping within seconds. The intruder does not panic. He walks calmly over to the iron safe in the corner, pulls out the missing real estate files regarding the Spanish property, and places them inside his coat. Then, he drops the silver pocket pistol onto the floorboards directly beneath the doctor's dangling right hand, slips back out through the laundry room window, and disappears into the pine trees. Johann Furbach spent the remainder of his life behind bars, consistently maintaining his innocence until he passed away from a sudden heart attack inside his prison cell in 1970. Vera Brun became a legendary figure in German criminal history, continuously launching a series of complex legal appeals and public relations campaigns from her cell, insisting that she was the perfect scapegoat for a massive government cover-up involving international arms dealers. In December of 1979, after serving nearly 18 years of her sentence, she was officially granted a controversial personal pardon by the minister-president of Bavaria and was released from prison, disappearing into absolute obscurity until her death in 2001. The true depth of Dr. Prawn's financial dealings remains buried deep inside declassified intelligence folders. While the grand villa in Pocking was eventually sold to a new family, who cleared away the old mahogany furniture, leaving the cold stones to guard their secrets. On the afternoon of April 24, 1964, a 31-year-old police sergeant named Lonnie Zamora was driving his patrol cruiser through the dusty, desolate southern outskirts of Socorro, New Mexico. The sun was beating down hard on the gravel lanes, and the desert air was thick with heat. Lonnie had been with the local department for several years, and he was known by everyone in town as a completely sober, practical man who kept his uniform pristine and his logbooks neat. Now, Lonnie wasn't the type of officer who went looking for excitement or high-profile cases, you know. He preferred the steady, predictable routine of monitoring traffic along the bypass, ensuring that local drivers adhered strictly to the posted speed limits. On this particular Friday, things had been exceptionally slow, and Lonnie was mostly just watching the minutes tick away on his dashboard clock, looking forward to finishing up his shift so he could finally head home and have a quiet dinner with his family. But around 5:45 in the evening, a sudden loud mechanical roar shattered the quiet of the bypass, and Lonnie saw a black Chevrolet sedan zip straight past his stationary cruiser, going way over the legal limit. Lonnie immediately flipped on his red emergency lights, stepped hard on the gas pedal, and gunned his engine to pursue the vehicle as it sped south toward the barren edge of town. The sedan was kicking up a massive cloud of yellow dust from the road shoulder, and Lonnie kept his eyes glued to the bumper. So Lonnie picked up his radio mic to update the dispatch desk that he was in active pursuit of a reckless driver who was heading into the unpopulated desert flats. But just as his cruiser was moving past the steep ridges near the local cemetery, a sudden deep chattering vibration rattled the entire frame of his vehicle. It wasn't the sound of an engine backfiring or a standard car horn. It was a massive, low-frequency rumble that seemed to shake the very air inside his chest. Lonnie slowed his cruiser down a bit, completely confused by the sound, and looked out through his open side window toward the steep, rocky ravines that lined the western horizon. And that's when he saw a massive flash of blue and orange flame shooting up into the clear sky about a half-mile away, followed closely by a thick, rising column of heavy black smoke. Lonnie knew that an old, isolated dynamite shack was located somewhere out in those gullies, and his immediate thought was that the facility had just suffered a catastrophic explosion. He knew that if any workers or technicians were out there handling explosives, they would be severely injured or trapped beneath burning timber, requiring immediate medical aid. So Lonnie made the split-second decision to abandon the traffic stop, turning his steering wheel sharply to the right and driving his cruiser off the paved asphalt onto a rough, unmaintained dirt path that led directly into the deep, rocky gullies. The path was incredibly steep and covered in loose gravel, and as he tried to force the vehicle up the rocky incline, the tires kept slipping and spinning in the loose sand, forcing him to stop twice, just to shift the transmission and prevent the cruiser's radiator from overheating in the intense desert heat. The thick column of smoke was rising steadily over the crest of the hill, and Lonnie kept his radio mic gripped tightly in his right hand, updating the dispatch operator that he was diverting into the ravines to check for casualties from a potential blast. When the cruiser finally cleared the top of the steep ridge, Lonnie drove slowly along the edge of a deep sandy ravine, searching the landscape for the remains of the wooden dynamite shack. But as he looked down into the wide hollow below, he saw something that made him slam his foot onto the brake pedal so hard that the cruiser skidded to abrupt halt. Resting at the bottom of the ravine about 150 yards away was an enormous, shiny, metallic object that looked exactly like an oversized egg. The strange craft was resting on long, stilt-like metal legs that went deep into the sand, keeping the bulk of the metallic frame elevated above the desert floor. Lonnie blinked hard, rubbing his eyes and adjusting his glasses because he thought the intense heat waves rising off the ground were creating some kind of a bizarre optical illusion. The object was completely smooth, with no windows, no visible rivets, and no exhaust pipes, but it did have a strange, boxy red insignia painted right on its side. But what caught Lonnie's attention more than the bizarre craft itself were two distinct figures standing directly beside the metallic legs, looking up toward the ridge where his cruiser had just appeared. The figures appeared to be quite small from that distance, roughly the size of young children or small adults, and they were dressed in bulky, pure white coveralls that completely covered their torsos and limbs. They didn't seem to be carrying any tools, and they were just standing there perfectly motionless in the white sand. So Lonnie reached for his radio mic again, his heart starting to accelerate as he called out for his Sergeant Sam Chavez, telling him to get out to the ravines immediately because he had encountered a highly irregular vehicle in the Sam Time Canyon. Lonnie stepped out of his cruiser, leaving the driver's side door wide open, and began walking slowly down the loose rocky slope toward the bottom of the ravine to see if the two individuals needed emergency assistance or if they were university engineering students. He thought they might be from the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology running an unannounced rocketry experiment in the flats. But the moment his boots crunched against a loose pile of gravel, the two small figures in white coveralls reacted instantly, turning around and jumping toward the side of the metallic craft. And before Lonnie could even call out to them, a massive deafening roar erupted from the bottom of the object, completely drowning out the sound of the desert wind. A brilliant, blinding streak of blue and white flame shot out from the base of the craft, kicking up a massive cloud of fine sand and small stones that slammed violently against Lonnie's face and torso. Lonnie instinctively turned around, throwing his arms over his head to shield his eyes, and ran violently back up the loose slope toward his cruiser, convinced that the entire object was about to detonate right in front of him. He dove onto the ground behind the rear bumper, keeping his head down. And as he lay there in the dirt, the deep mechanical vibration was so powerful that it rattled the very keys on his belt. When the roaring sound suddenly stopped, Lonnie cautiously peeked over the trunk of his car, and he saw the massive egg-shaped object was already rising vertically out of the ravine, completely silent now that the flame had vanished. It hovered for a brief second at the level of the telephone poles, then accelerated horizontally at an unbelievable speed. The craft passed directly over the local water tank, moving in a straight line before disappearing completely over the jagged mountains to the west within a matter of seconds. Less than 3 minutes later, Sergeant Sam Chavez pulled his own patrol vehicle up the rocky ridge, his tires kicking up a massive cloud of dust as he slammed on the brakes next to Lonnie's cruiser. Chavez hopped out with his service revolver drawn, expecting to find an active shooter or a massive structural fire. Instead, he found Lonnie standing by the bumper, his face completely pale beneath a layer of white desert dust, staring blankly down into the empty canyon. Lonnie pointed a shaking finger down into the sand, his voice cracking with emotion as he tried to explain the massive object that had just taken off into the sky. Chavez walked down into the hollow with Lonnie, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of an elaborate practical joke or a local college prank. He knew Lonnie was a deeply reliable officer who never drank or made things up, so he took the claim seriously. And when they finally reached the exact spot at the bottom of the ravine where the object had been sitting, both officers stopped dead in their tracks. The sand wasn't just disturbed by the wind, you see. There were 4 deep, perfectly rectangular depressions pressed into the hard, sun-baked desert soil, forming a distinct symmetric quadrangle pattern on the ground. Directly next to those deep indentations, a large clump of desert brush was burning with a strange low flame. Lonnie stepped closer, noticing that the branches weren't just charred by a standard brush fire. They were completely scorched by an intense, high-velocity heat source that had turned the green leaves into pure gray ash while leaving the surrounding roots untouched. Chavez reached down to touch the soil near the indentations, but he quickly pulled his hand back because the earth was radiating an intense heat. Within 2 hours, the absolute isolation of the Socorro Ravine was completely shattered as high-ranking military officers and federal investigators began pouring into the site. Captain Richard T. Holder, the commander of the nearby White Sands Missile Range, arrived with a team of military police and immediately cordoned off the entire ridge with heavy wire. He brought in specialized measuring tools to record the depth of the rectangular depressions and took multiple soil samples from the quadrangle. They wanted to check the area for radioactive residue, exotic chemical compounds, or footprints left by the 2 small figures. The declassified FBI vault records would later show that a special agent from the Albuquerque field office was also dispatched to Socorro that night to conduct a comprehensive security review. The federal authorities were deeply concerned that a foreign adversary or a domestic defense contractor had accidentally crashed a highly classified experimental aircraft near a civilian zone. The investigators began running immediate checks on all flight logs, commercial radar stations, and military testing schedules across the state of New Mexico, but every single airbase reported that their scopes were completely clear at 5:45 that evening. The case was eventually handed over directly to Project Blue Book, which was the United States Air Force's specialized branch tasked with investigating unexplained aerial phenomena and determining whether they posed a genuine threat to national security. The Air Force brass decided to send their top scientific consultant, a highly respected astronomer and professor from Northwestern University, named Dr. J. Allen Hynek, straight to Socorro to interview Lonnie Zamora and separate the facts from the local rumors. Dr. Hynek arrived in town expecting to find a classic case of misidentification. Perhaps a tired officer who had mistaken a standard weather balloon or a flock of low-flying birds for something extraordinary due to the glare of the late afternoon sun. Hynek sat down with Lonnie inside a private back office at the police headquarters, reviewing his personal background, his medical records, and his recent vision tests to ensure that his eyesight was perfect. He spent hours asking Lonnie to repeat his story over and over again, looking for any subtle changes in the details or signs of psychological fabrication. But to Hynek's surprise, Lonnie remained completely consistent, calm, and deeply reluctant to even use the words spaceship or alien during the interview. Lonnie simply stated what he had physically seen with his own eyes, describing the smooth metallic frame, the red insignia, and the white coveralls. Hynek walked down into the ravine himself, verifying the measurements of the landing gear marks, and concluded that it would require an object weighing several tons to press those distinct rectangular indents so deeply into the hard desert soil. Hynek officially declared Lonnie Zamora to be a highly credible, completely reliable witness, making it an unresolved case. Despite months of intensive laboratory analysis on the scorched vegetation, Project Blue Book was completely unable to identify the source of the heat listing, the Socorro incident, as one of the few officially unresolved UAP cases in video. American history. Based on the declassified Air Force archives, FBI memorandums, and Lonnie's original sworn statements, here is a reconstruction of what occurred in the ravine on that afternoon. At exactly 5:46 in the evening, the craft sits silently at the bottom of the dusty gully, its heavy landing gear locked deep into the desert earth. The 2 figures in the bulky white coveralls move systematically around the smooth, metallic exterior, checking the structural seals and ensuring that the internal propulsion chambers are stable after their descent. They hear the sudden sharp crunch of gravel from the ridge above and freeze, looking up to see the white patrol cruiser skidding to a halt along the rim. The figures move with incredible speed, scrambling through a hidden hatch into the belly of the egg-shaped craft before the solitary officer can even make his way halfway down the rocky slope. Inside the cockpit, the pilot engages the primary ignition sequence, causing a massive, pressurized mixture of liquid fuel to detonate through the central exhaust cone. A brilliant blast of blue flame erupts into the sand, instantly scorching the nearby desert bushes and sending a wave of burning heat across the ground. The craft lifts vertically into the clear sky, transitioning from a deafening roar to absolute silence as it tilts on its axis and speeds away over the western mountains, leaving the desert completely empty once again. Lonnie Zamora eventually left the Socorro Police Department entirely weary of the constant media attention. Late-night telephone calls from curiosity seekers, and the endless teasing from tourists who would stop by his station just to ask about the little men in white suits. He took a quiet job managing a local gas station, refusing to do any more public interviews or cash in on his fame, and carried his experiences quietly until his death from a heart attack in 2009. The physical impressions in the Socorro sand were eventually smoothed over by decades of desert wind and seasonal flash floods, leaving nothing but an empty gully under the New Mexico sun. The declassified folders of Project Blue Book remain sealed inside the National Archives, their pages yellowing with age. The coordinate details in the sand remain completely silent while the wind continues to sweep over the ancient stone hills. And while the hoarse winds of the American Southwest continue to blow across the empty flats thousands of miles away, inside a completely different climate, a group of young schoolgirls would step into a strictly managed classroom only to find themselves caught inside a bizarre, contagious psychological chain reaction that would completely baffle the world's top medical investigators. On a humid November afternoon in 1961, a 23-year-old American man named Michael Rockefeller stood on the muddy wooden deck of a custom-built catamaran off the coast of Netherlands, New Guinea. He was wearing a pair of old mud-splattered khaki trousers, a loose cotton shirt, and thick glasses that were constantly fogging up in the intense sticky humidity of the tropical coast. Now, Michael was not an ordinary explorer, you know. He was the son of Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, and the heir to one of the most powerful and wealthy family fortunes in the entire world. But instead of living a comfortable life inside a luxury penthouse in Manhattan, Michael had spent the last several months wading through waist-deep swamps, sleeping on the wooden floors of communal longhouses, and dealing with swarms of insects just to collect indigenous art from the remote Asmat region. He was accompanied on this trip by René Wassing, a 34-year-old Dutch anthropologist who had been assigned by the colonial government to help him navigate the complicated local territory. The air around them was thick with the heavy scent of low-tide silt and rotting vegetation from the nearby mangrove roots, and the only real sound for miles was the constant drone of insects nesting deep within the dense jungle canopy. Michael had become completely obsessed with the complex, intricate wood carvings created by the Asmat craftsmen, especially the massive ceremonial structures and decorated wooden shields. He believed this art was some of the most profound and expressive work on the face of the earth, and his dream was to gather enough pieces to fill an entire new wing of a museum back in New York City. To travel between the isolated coastal settlements that were separated by a vast network of volatile rivers and deep mudflats, Michael had purchased 2 long, narrow dugout canoes from a local village. He had hired native carpenters to lay a wide wooden platform across the top of both hulls, kind of creating a makeshift catamaran that could carry heavy loads of cargo. He had also bolted a small 20-horsepower outboard motor to the wooden stern, believing that this custom craft would give them the total freedom to explore the entire coastline with ease. But on this particular afternoon, as they prepared to head back toward the main base, the sky began to turn a dark, heavy shade of gray, and the water at the mouth of the wide river was turning into a chaotic mass of short, steep waves. And as soon as they steered the heavily loaded catamaran out into the open water where the strong river current collided directly with the ocean tide, the limitations of their makeshift boat became apparent. The extra weight of the massive wooden poles and shields caused the 2 dugout hulls to sit incredibly low in the water. And with every passing wave, a thick sheet of salty spray washed completely across the deck, soaking their supplies and filling the open cavities of the canoes. The 2 local guides Michael had hired to help navigate the channels began to look visibly concerned, pointing out that the cross currents in this section of the coast were notoriously unpredictable, but the outboard motor was humming steadily, and Michael was eager to reach their next destination before nightfall. Suddenly, a massive wave slammed directly into the side of the catamaran, lifting the port canoe into the air and throwing the entire craft at a dangerous angle. The 20-horsepower motor let out a loud mechanical sputter as water flooded the open carburetor, and then it died completely, leaving the heavy steel and wood structure completely at the mercy of the strong outgoing current. So within a matter of minutes, the catamaran began to drift rapidly away from the shore, drawn out into the deep water by the force of the tide. Michael and Renee immediately grabbed empty plastic buckets and began frantically scooping water out of the submerged canoes, but the waves were coming too fast, filling the hulls faster than the men could work. Before long, the weight of the water flipped the entire platform upside down, dumping the 4 men and their heavy carvings into the sea. They managed to scramble onto the slippery smooth underside of the overturned platform, gripping the wet wood as the wind began to pick up, driving the cold spray directly into their eyes. The 2 local guides looked at the shrinking line of green mangroves on the horizon and realized that if they stayed with the floating wreck, they would be carried out into the deep ocean where survival was impossible. They turned to Michael, shouted that they would swim to the shore to bring back a rescue party, and then they dove into the water, disappearing into the gray waves. Michael and Renee were left completely alone on the slick wooden platform as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the ocean into absolute darkness. They spent 14 hours clinging to the dead motor and the wooden frames, their muscles cramping violently from the cold and their skin burning from the constant friction of the salt crust. Michael kept a constant watch on the dark horizon, hoping to see the searchlights of a government vessel, but there was only the sound of the ocean slamming against the wood. By the time the morning sun broke through the heavy sea haze on November 18th, the catamaran had drifted an estimated 3 to 10 miles away from the coast. The shoreline was barely visible, appearing as a faint, blurred green line through the thick morning mist. Michael looked at Renee, his face pale and his lips blue from the early stages of hypothermia, and stated that he didn't think the rescue party would be able to locate them this far out at sea. He pointed down at 2 empty red plastic jerry cans that had broken loose from their straps and were bobbing up and down in the water right next to the platform. Michael reached out, pulled the 2 empty jerry cans toward him, and shook them to ensure that there was no residual fuel left inside the plastic chambers. He took a long piece of thick nylon rope from the dead motor, wrapped it tightly around his waistband several times, and then secured each end to the plastic handles of the cans, creating a makeshift buoyancy belt that would keep his shoulders above the water. Renee tried to argue with him, pointing out that the coastal currents were incredibly powerful and that swimming several miles through waters known to be populated by massive sharks and crocodiles was an extreme risk for an exhausted, powerful man. But Michael was determined to take control of his own survival. He looked at his companion, adjusted his grip on the red plastic handles, and said, "I think I can make it." Then he slid off the edge of the overturned platform into the gray water and began swimming steadily toward the distant shore using a slow, rhythmic breaststroke. Renee watched from the platform as the 2 red dots bobbed up and down on the swells, growing smaller and smaller until they completely vanished into the morning fog. Late that afternoon, a Dutch maritime patrol boat that had been deployed after the 2 local guides finally reached the shore, spotted the overturned catamaran drifting far out in the shipping lanes. The crew pulled a severely dehydrated, barely conscious Renee Wassing from the wood, but there was no sign of Michael Rockefeller anywhere in the surrounding sea. The news of the missing billionaire heir triggered a massive, unprecedented search operation that completely dominated international headlines for weeks. Nelson Rockefeller immediately chartered a private plane and flew directly to the remote territory, bringing with him a massive army of journalists, investigators, and family staff. The Dutch government mobilized naval vessels, thousands of soldiers, and low-flying military aircraft to search every single bay and estuary along the coast. Helicopters hovered just above the tree line, their searchlights cutting through the dense canopy, while hundreds of local Asmat warriors in long dugout canoes paddled through the narrow mud channels looking for any trace of the red plastic containers or the clothing Michael had been wearing. But after 2 weeks of continuous intensive searching, the rescue teams found absolutely nothing. Not a single piece of debris, no plastic fragments, and no footprints in the thick coastal mudflats. The official conclusion from the colonial authorities was that Michael had simply succumbed to exhaustion and drowned before reaching the shore, his body carried away into the deep ocean by the powerful undercurrents. Other experts pointed out that the massive river mouths were heavily infested with large saltwater crocodiles, suggesting that the young man had been taken while swimming through the open channels. With no physical evidence to prove otherwise, the official search was called off, the family returned to New York, and the case was officially closed as a tragic death by drowning at sea. But deep inside the isolated native villages tucked away in the mangrove swamps, a completely different story began to spread through the smoke-filled communal longhouses. Years after the incident, Catholic missionaries who lived permanently among the Asmat people, including a priest named Father Cornelius van Kessel, began to notice that several young men from the village of Otsjanep were in possession of strange Western items, including distinctive clothing and heavy frames that could not have been traded for. During private conversations, tribal elders confided in the priests, revealing a dark secret that had been kept hidden from the government patrols. The missionaries began writing detailed, confidential reports and sending them directly to the regional Dutch administrators, but the colonial government was in the process of pulling out of the territory and chose to bury the files to avoid an international incident. It wasn't until decades later, when an investigative journalist named Karl Hoffman located the original archives and spent months living inside the village of Otsjanep, that the true nature of Michael's fate was finally brought to light, revealing that the events of November 1961 were directly tied to a violent raid that had occurred 3 years prior in 1958. You see, in 1958, a Dutch colonial officer named Max Lepre had entered the village of Otsjanep with a squad of heavily armed police to settle a violent dispute between rival clans. The sudden appearance of the soldiers caused a massive panic among the residents. And when several high-ranking village chiefs stepped forward with their wooden shields to confront the officer, the police opened fire on the crowd, shooting dead 5 of the village's most important traditional leaders. In Asmat culture, the universe is governed by a strict spiritual balance of life and death. And when a member of the tribe is killed by an outsider, their spirit remains restless, causing sickness and bad luck within the community, until a matching life is taken from the enemy's clan to balance the ledger. For 3 years, the warriors of Otsjanep had been living under the shadow of an unfulfilled blood debt against the white men who had killed their chiefs, waiting for an opportunity to restore the balance. And that opportunity arrived on a cold morning in November 1961, when a line of warriors in long canoes spotted a solitary white man floating in the thick mud near the mangrove roots. Based on declassified Dutch colonial records, missionary journals and interviews gathered decades later, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened when Michael Rockefeller reached the coast. The line of long wooden canoes slides in perfect synchronized silence through the murky brown water near the edge of the mangrove swamp, the paddles barely breaking the surface. The warriors from the village of Otsjanep are out scanning the mudflats for fish when they notice a strange, rhythmic splashing sound coming from a narrow channel near the exposed roots. As they paddle closer, they see a white man crawling on his hands and knees through the thick black mud. He is completely naked, except for a pair of wet undergarments, and his skin is covered in hundreds of deep scratches from the sharp marsh grass. He has 2 empty red plastic jerry cans tied to his waist with a length of rope, and he is so physically exhausted from swimming for nearly 24 hours that he cannot even lift his head to look at the approaching boats collapsing forward into the wet earth to gasp for air. The canoes quickly form a circle around the struggling man, and several young warriors step out into the knee-deep mud, their long wooden spears held at their sides. They look down at the helpless stranger, and one of the older men instantly recognizes him as the wealthy white man who had been visiting the nearby settlements to buy their wooden carvings. But as they stand there in the silence, a young warrior named Ajik steps forward, his face completely expressionless. Ajik's uncle had been one of the traditional chiefs, shot dead by the Dutch police officer during the massacre of 1958. And for 3 years, his family had been carrying the spiritual burden of that unpaid debt. He looks at the other men in the circle, points his finger at the exhausted man in the mud, and states that this is their chance to finally balance the spirits of their dead ancestors. The other warriors look around at the empty horizon, realizing that the government patrol boats are miles away, and that nobody will ever see what happens inside the silent canopy of the swamp. Without saying another word, Ajik raises his heavy wooden spear and drives it directly into the white man's torso. The stranger lets out a single sharp cry of pain, his fingers clawing at the black mud for a brief second before his body goes completely limp. The other warriors immediately step forward, using their sharp bone knives to remove his clothing, his thick glasses, and the red plastic jerry cans, tossing the small Western items deep into the current, where they sink into the heavy silt. They lift the body into the long canoes, paddle silently back toward the village of Otsjanep, and perform the ancient ceremonial rituals required to close the blood debt, ensuring that the restless spirits of their chiefs can finally rest. The village elders meet later that evening in the dark, swearing every single resident to absolute silence, promising that if any government official ever asks about the missing white man, they will say he was swallowed by the ocean. Currents. Michael Rockefeller's remains were never recovered, and he remains officially listed as dead by drowning in the international registries. The massive collection of Asmat art that he risked his life to secure was eventually shipped to New York, where it sits inside a secure gallery at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, thousands of miles away from the silent mangrove swamps, where it was originally carved. The village of Otsjanep eventually went back to its daily routines, the secret preserved through quiet whispers from fathers to sons buried deep within the history of colonial violence. In the early months of 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller decided to leave behind the extreme comfort of his highly privileged life in New York City. Now, Michael was not just anyone you know. His father was Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, and one of the wealthiest, most powerful men on the entire planet. But Michael had absolutely no interest in corporate banking, managing real estate portfolios, or climbing the political ladder. He possessed a deep, burning passion for primitive anthropology, and he wanted to explore the most remote corners of the globe to study ancient human expression. This passion eventually led him to the southwest coast of Netherlands, New Guinea, a place known as the Asmat region. Back then, this area was one of the most isolated spots on Earth, covered entirely by thick mangrove swamps, treacherous mudflats, and deep, dark rivers. The air was constantly heavy, with suffocating humidity, and the non-stop buzzing of millions of mosquitoes. There were no roads, no modern amenities, and the local tribes had only recently made contact with the outside world, maintaining many of their ancient headhunting traditions and spiritual ceremonies. Michael was completely fascinated by the Asmat people, especially their spectacular wood carvings. They created these massive, 10-foot-tall ceremonial structures called bis poles, which were carved out of single mangrove trees to honor the spirits of ancestors and appease the dead. Michael believed this work was some of the most raw and expressive art in existence. He spent his days traveling from one village to another, wading through waist-deep mud and trading steel axe heads, knives, and rolls of strong tobacco leaves for these precious cultural sculptures. To help him navigate this difficult and unfamiliar terrain, the colonial government assigned a 34-year-old Dutch anthropologist named René Wassing to be his guide and companion. René was a methodical, careful academic who understood the local languages and custom systems, and he quickly became a trusted partner for Michael. Together, they amassed an incredible collection of shields, spears, and carvings, storing them at a temporary base camp along the coast while they planned their next big exploration journey into the interior rivers. For their transportation, Michael had constructed a rather unique watercraft. He took two long, narrow native dugout canoes and lashed them together side by side with a wide wooden platform, creating a makeshift catamaran. He then bolted a small 20-horsepower outboard motor to the back of the platform. This allowed them to carry immense amounts of heavy cargo through the shallow coastal waters. But the craft sat dangerously low in the sea, especially when it was completely packed to the brim with heavy wooden artifacts and barrels of fuel. On the morning of November 17, 1961, Michael and René loaded their catamaran for a routine trip down the coast toward the administrative town of Agates. They had two local teenage guides with them to help watch the tides and steer through the narrow channels. As they steered the heavy, unstabilized craft out of the safety of the river mouth, the weather began to turn bad. The wind picked up significantly, and the open sea turned into a chaotic mass of short, steep waves that began slamming against the wooden platform. The wide platform began to tilt awkwardly as water slopped over the shallow sides of the dugout canoes, soaking their blankets and heavy equipment. The two local guides looked out at the rough water and expressed serious concern, knowing that the powerful river currents were colliding directly with the ocean tide to create dangerous cross-currents. But Michael was confident in his custom boat and pushed ahead, keeping the small motor running at full throttle to combat the heavy swell that was growing larger by the minute. Suddenly, a massive wave crashed directly over the bow, flooding the open hulls and completely overwhelming the low clearance of the catamaran. The small 20-horsepower engine let out a loud mechanical sputter as salt water poured into the fuel intake, and then it died completely. They were left dead in the water, Caught in a powerful riptide that began dragging the heavy waterlogged wooden platform rapidly away from the line of mangroves straight out into the open sea of the Arafura. Within a matter of minutes, another large wave flipped the entire platform upside down, dumping all 4 men and their heavy cargo into the sea. They managed to scramble onto the slippery, smooth underside of the overturned canoes, gripping the wet wood tightly as the current pulled them further away from land. The 2 local guides looked at the shrinking green coast on the horizon and realized that staying with the drifting wreck meant certain death. They turned to Michael and shouted that they were going to swim for it to find help. The 2 teenagers dove into the sea and swam away with powerful strokes, disappearing behind the gray swells. Michael and Renee were left completely alone on the slippery wood as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the ocean into total darkness. They spent 14 grueling hours clinging to the frame, their muscles cramping violently from the cold water and their skin burning from the salt. The only sound was the non-stop roaring of the waves and the wind as they drifted deeper into the shipping lanes. By the time the morning sun broke through the heavy sea fog on November 18th, the catamaran had drifted an estimated 3 to 10 miles out into the deep ocean. The shoreline was nothing more than a faint, blurred line through the thick mist. Michael looked at the open water and realized that the rescue party might never locate them in this vast expanse. He then noticed 2 empty red plastic jerry cans that had broken loose from their storage straps and were bobbing in the water right next to the hulls. Michael reached out and pulled the plastic containers toward him, confirming they were empty and full of air. He took a length of thick nylon rope from the dead motor and wrapped it tightly around his waistband, securing each end to the handles of the jerry cans to create a makeshift buoyancy belt. Renee tried to talk him out of it, warning him that the currents were too strong and that the water was filled with massive sharks and saltwater crocodiles. But Michael was exhausted from waiting and refused to stay on the wreck. He looked directly at Renee, adjusted his grip on the plastic handles, and simply said, "I think I can make it." Then he slid off the edge of the platform into the gray swells and began swimming steadily toward the distant coast, using a slow, deliberate breaststroke. Renee watched as the 2 red containers bobbed up and down on the water, growing smaller and smaller until they completely vanished into the heavy fog, leaving him entirely alone on the overturned boat to wait for rescue. Later that afternoon, a colonial patrol boat spotted the drifting platform and rescued a severely dehydrated, barely conscious Renee Wassing. When he told the crew that Michael Rockefeller had vanished into the ocean hours earlier, it triggered the largest and most intensive search operation the region had ever seen. Nelson Rockefeller flew directly to the territory with an army of searchers and reporters deploying naval ships, helicopters, and thousands of local tribesmen to search every bay and mudflat. For 2 weeks, the rescue team scoured the coastline, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no trace of the red plastic containers, no clothing, and no footprints in the thick mud. The official investigation concluded that Michael had simply succumbed to exhaustion and drowned, or had been attacked by a crocodile before reaching land. The family eventually returned to New York, and the case was closed as a tragic accident. But deep inside the isolated native villages, a completely different story was beginning to emerge. Years later, a Dutch missionary priest named Father Cornelius van Kessel began hearing dark whispers among the elders of a specific village called Otsgenep. The priest discovered that some of the young men in the village were in possession of unique Western items, including an old pair of heavy-rimmed glasses and distinctive clothing. As he dug deeper into the rumors, a horrifying secret came to light. Michael Rockefeller hadn't drowned in the open ocean at all. He had actually made it to the coast, only to swim straight into a blood feud. You see, 3 years earlier, in 1958, a Dutch colonial officer named Max Lapre had led a violent raid on the village of Otsgenep to settle a local conflict. During the chaos, the colonial police opened fire on the crowd, shooting dead 5 of the village's most important traditional chiefs. In the culture of the Asmat people, the universe requires a strict spiritual balance. If a member of the tribe is killed by an outsider, their spirit remains restless, bringing bad luck until a matching life is taken from the enemy's clan. For 3 long years, the warriors of Otsgenep had been waiting for an opportunity to balance the spirits of their murdered chiefs and exact their revenge against the white men who had brought violence to their home. And on that morning, in November of 1961, a group of those very same warriors was sitting in their dugout canoes near the edge of the mangrove swamp when they spotted a solitary white man dragging his exhausted body out of the surf onto the black mudflats. Based on the declassified colonial archives, private missionary reports, and subsequent investigations, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Michael Rockefeller on that morning. A dozen long wooden war canoes glide in perfect silence through the shallow water near the edge of the swamp. the warriors holding their paddles completely still to avoid making a sound. They are out looking for fish when they notice a strange disturbance in the deep mud. As they paddle closer through the mist, they see a white man crawling onto the shore. He is completely spent, his body trembling with weakness, and his skin covered in deep scratches from the sharp roots. 2 red jerry cans are still tied to his waist. The warriors pull their boats onto the mudflat, forming a silent circle around the helpless explorer. One of the older men recognizes him as the wealthy collector who had visited the region, but a young warrior named Ajik steps forward, his face completely cold. Ajik's family had carried the spiritual burden of his uncle's death during the 1958 massacre, and he looks at the other men, stating that the universe has delivered the perfect sacrifice to settle the old debt. The elders realize that no one will ever know what happens in this hidden swamp. Without a moment of hesitation, Ajik raises his heavy wooden spear and drives it directly into the white man's chest. Michael lets out a single gasp, his fingers clawing at the black silt before his body goes completely rigid. The warriors immediately use their bone knives to remove his clothing and his thick glasses, taking the red jerry cans and throwing them into the deep current where they sink into the heavy mud. They lift the body into the canoes, return to Otsjanep, and perform the ancient rituals to close the blood debt. The village elders met later that night and forced every single resident to take an absolute oath of silence to protect the community from the heavy retaliation of the government patrols. Michael Rockefeller's remains were never found, and his family back in New York spent decades believing he had died at sea. The massive collection of art he gathered was eventually displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, completely silent about the violent end of the man who had traveled across the world to find it. When we consider the story of Michael Rockefeller, the true weight of the tragedy does not settle until long after the narrative ends, leaving a lingering resonance that forces us to look past the surface elements of a typical disappearance. It is a story that addresses our deepest anxieties about vulnerability, because it places the ultimate symbol of modern security and limitless wealth into a completely indifferent primal landscape where those advantages mean absolutely nothing. We are forced to confront the absolute helplessness of a human being stripped of the societal structures that establish our safety, highlighting how thin the barrier between civilization and chaos truly is. The fascination with this case survives because it subverts our expectations of personal power and protection. In our regular lives, we assume that position, fortune, and family status establish a protective shield around us, offering a baseline of security that isolates us from the raw, violent mechanisms of the natural world. But out on the muddy water of the river mouth under a dark sky, those millions of dollars could not keep a small wooden platform from overturning, and they could not spark a dead outboard motor back to life. The landscape did not care who Michael's father was, and the waves did not alter their trajectory for an American dynasty. This contrast creates a profound sense of existential fear, because it reminds us that our personal safety is entirely situational, dependent on an infrastructure that we take for granted every single day. When Michael slid off the edge of those overturned canoes into the gray swells, he was entering an environment that operated on rules completely independent of human law or economic power. His decision to leave the relative safety of the floating wreck highlights a massive universal lesson regarding personal responsibility and the limits of human confidence when facing an uncaring environment. Renee Wassing stayed with the boat, relying on the cold logic of patience and structure, understanding that a large object in the shipping lanes is far easier for a patrol ship to spot than a solitary swimmer lost in miles of gray foam. Michael, driven by the confidence that had defined his entire life as a member of the world's elite class, chose to force his own destiny, believing that his will and a pair of red plastic containers could overcome the Arafura Sea. That final statement, where he looked at his companion and said he thought he could make it, is perhaps the most haunting sentence in the entire case. It is a phrase that reflects the tragic delusion of human control over a world that is fundamentally volatile and unpredictable. He assumed the shoreline was a place of safety, a baseline of dry ground where his survival would be guaranteed, entirely unaware that the geography he was swimming toward was already deeply infected with a historical trauma that his family fortune could never repair. The social lessons behind this case are deeply intertwined with the dark legacy of colonial violence and the law of unintended consequences. The village of Otsjanep did not attack Michael out of random, unprovoked savagery, nor did they see him as a simple target of opportunity. They operated on a highly sophisticated ancient system of cosmic justice that had been severely disrupted 3 years earlier by the bullets of a Dutch colonial officer. To the warriors on the mudflats, Michael was not an individual art collector from New York. He was the physical manifestation of the white system that had left their chief's spirits restless and their community out of balance. His skin color was his uniform, and his presence on their shore was the answer to a spiritual equation that required a life to settle a debt. The tragedy illustrates the terrible randomness of historical patterns, where an innocent young man who genuinely loved the local culture and wanted to preserve its artistic heritage was forced to pay the price for a historical atrocity, committed by a government he did not represent. The community's reaction inside Otsjanev, where the elders established a total, multi-generational oath of silence, reveals the immense defensive cohesion of a group trying to survive against an overwhelming external power. They knew that if the colonial government discovered the truth, the retaliation would be swift and devastating, potentially destroying their entire way of life. So they buried the Western items, threw the red plastic containers into the deep river silt, and allowed the world to believe the ocean had taken the young man. This collective silence held for decades, resisting the pressure of international investigations, family, money, and journalists, proving that the bond of community survival is far stronger than any individual reward. When we look at far stockets displaying Michael's name inside the climate-controlled rooms of the Manhattan Museum today, the objects carry a cold, silent irony. They were collected by a man who wanted to capture the spirit of a people entirely unaware that the spirit he was chasing was part of a cycle of violence that would eventually swallow him whole. The carvings remain beautiful, intricate, and perfectly preserved behind heavy sheets of glass completely disconnected from the dark mud, the heat, and the blood that defined their journey to the West. The case leaves us with a detached, lingering lesson about our place in the world.